Good evening, everyone. I call the September 20th, 2022 school board meeting to order. It is 6:07 p.m. We are in conference room C of the Fisher Administration Building at 12121 West North Avenue. Dr. Means, please call the roll.
Ms. Moonfeld.
Here.
Ms. Fairley.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Dr. Jessup Anger.
Here.
Dr. Hoy.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Ms. Willis.
Here.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. We are really, this is meant to be kind of an informal conversation where we're working through the MOU between the Wauwatosa School District and the Police Department of the Wauwatosa. This is something that I know I talked to Dr. Ertl about like last time I was board president, of saying something had come up and I had asked kind of about this document. Dr. Means started on this with Chief McGillis several months ago. And we've been continuing conversations. We had a meeting scheduled that we needed to cancel for very reasonable reasons in July. Yes. The board was not able to take this up because of our needed to focus during the month of August on our strategic plan so that was prepared before the beginning of the year. And then wanted to make sure we came back to it right away as soon as we could reschedule in September. So we are here to kind of just work through some key details. I'm going to ask Dr. Means to kind of do a setting up of the work that's been done, what the processes look like, clear community interest in this topic, so we can kind of get a sense of why is an MOU a thing? How is it important? What does it all mean? How does it fit with the broader scope of things? And then we'll just kind of talk through and continue working through this tonight. There's no board action tonight, so we're not approving an MOU or not approving an MOU. We're kind of talking through it. My plan is to give each board member, if they have things that they'd like to discuss, we'll give 10 minutes to each to start, and then you may pass. This may be something that you want to hear from your colleagues first, and then we'll do a final opportunity. I'm sure Chief McGillis and Sergeant Morrill, want to make sure I got the designation correct. We'll have some things we'll talk through as well. And the goal will just be to tick off all the things, kind of get to a place and then go back and do all the wordsmithing that needs to happen. And then ultimately, the goal will be for this to end up back on an agenda for board action at a future meeting. So that's our goal tonight. This is kind of like getting to watch how the sausage is made. May not be particularly exciting and probably not particularly explosive or anything else. This is just public servants trying to figure out how to get things to work well together. Dr. Means? And gentlemen, do you want to come up to join us?
Just as an overview and backdrop, the school district has a long-standing relationship with the Wauwatosa Police Department. We have a good working relationship. In terms of documentation, there is a letter from then Chief Weber in September of 2014 outlining the relationship and what the SRO or school resource officer process would look like. In most school districts, there is a memorandum of understanding or MOU between the school district and the police department. And we're going to kind of unpack all of these different things this evening, but the expenditure around this relationship is $400,000. Right now, we've been utilizing Fund 80, that is called the Community Service Fund, to pay for our outstanding service from our school resource officers. The Community Service Fund is different than Fund 10, which is the general fund where we pay for teachers and books and so on. And we can talk about this a little bit later. I think our school resource officers are doing the majority of the work that is obligated by the Department of Public Instruction, or DPI, to utilize Fund 80. There are certain stipulations that the governing body or DPI has stated you have to do in order for the school district to use Fund 80 to pay for our school resource officers. It is a great benefit to us to use Fund 80 for this service, and we're pleased that I think we're really close to meeting those stipulations, but I would assume that this evening you would discuss it.
Can you explain why it's a benefit to use Fund 80?
Yes.
Thank you.
So Fund 80 is a different fund. It does not blend into the fund that we use to pay for teachers or for books or other instructional needs. It is a separate levy that we provide to the community. And the name of it itself is community service, is the community service fund. Often people leap to the recreation department when we discuss Fund 80, but there are a lot of different ways you can utilize Fund 80. And in the past, this district has been very strategic and forward thinking and utilizing Fund 80 for this service.
We aren't penalized from the levy from the tertiary spending for overspending.
That's correct.
Not that we do overspend, but we get $1 services for $1 taxpayer money. In Fund 10, at the margin, we lose aid for every $1 we spend. I think that needs to be understood by people. Thank you. I don't want to interrupt, but that's really important. It saves us money.
What Mr. Meyer is referencing is that the nuance of the legislature and how they control Fund 10, and it's not $1 for dollar. It's transfer with tax dollars versus what we spend. That's not available in Fund 10. That is available in Fund 80. And so it's beneficial for a number of different reasons. Not only are you getting $1 for dollar value, but also it keeps the expenditure for this great service counting against what we need for teachers and books and other instructional materials. It is usual and customary for school districts to have a memorandum of understanding with their police department. And so we started the process of identifying the fact, and I want to thank Ms. Laura Greisler, who's our safety coordinator, and Mr. Lupinian, our chief of people and family supports. We realized that early last year, that we didn't have a memorandum of understanding in place. And that's not to indicate that there's a lack of interest of continuing the relationship. It was simply, we need to do our due diligence and document the relationship. And so that's why we're here this evening to talk through the finer points of the memorandum of understanding. I think there are varying opinions and perspectives on the memorandum of understanding. I think this is good that we're having these discussions. I know the chief and Sergeant Morrow and I have really, I think we've had a lot of good discussions around this, but I think it's now time for the board to be engaged in these discussions as well. And we started the process, but we just ran out of time. And I'm really happy and pleased that we're here this evening to continue the conversation. I'll let them introduce themselves, but I would say we have two individuals who are deeply invested in our community. Chief McGillis is a proud graduate of Wauwatosa West and grew up here. And while this is a different stage in his career, I've talked to him and I've talked to people who know him in his previous department. They know he is tinkle. He's just really tickle pink that he's here. And so we're happy that you're back home. And Sergeant Morrow is a former school resource officer. He served as a school resource officer at Wauwatosa East. And so he's walked the walk. And I think that's really valuable to have someone who has done the work. So without further ado, unless you have questions for me in terms of background, I want to turn it over to a chief and a sergeant for their perspective.
You want to go ahead? Sure. Thank you, Dr. Mays, everybody. As you said, you talked about our passion for this and our interest for this. And I really wanted to take an opportunity to talk about that for a moment. He said I was a school resource officer. Indeed, I was for 7 years at Tosa East. And I can tell you our police department right now is understaffed. We could use everybody on the street. We would benefit from pulling the SROs from the school district and using them on the street. However, we don't feel that benefits the community nor the students or the staff, everyone it serves. I am absolutely, without a doubt, passionate about having the SROs in the school district, having walked the walk, as Dr. Means pointed out. I see the values in it. I've seen so many positive things come from it, whether that be dealing with an incident at the school, with something that is a legal matter, or a student who's in crisis at home and really doesn't know who to talk to, that they come to the SRO, or that kid that just stops in the office each day and grabs a bottle of water and wants to talk to somebody other than maybe their teacher or somebody else. We build relationships. That's the number one goal of our program, is to build relationships. We clearly benefit from that by having building relationships in the community with those kids who have good experiences with the SRO. They go out in the community and suddenly maybe their perspective or what they think police are really isn't necessarily true. That if they had a bad impression or a bad experience, we try to give them a good experience. That's a huge benefit for us as a police department. So I guess I say this because what I'm trying to say is we don't need your money, and however it's funded, it should be funded. And we're not doing this because we think this is a benefit for this, like running a business where we're like, we really need this account. We don't need the account. We want the account. We want to be a part of your schools. We want to continue. We've been doing this for nearly 20 years, and we can't wait to continue. We're very hopeful that we get through all the things in the MOU, answer any questions that you have regarding it, and continue with this great program.
Thank you.
How do I follow that up?
Yeah.
Chief McGillis, we've met before. I know Jim, Sergeant Morrill, from back in his recruit days. I actually was one of his trainers back at the Milwaukee Police Academy.
How did he do?
Say again?
How did he do?
He did very well. And I was so happy to see Sergeant Morrill when I came to the Wauwatosa Police Department, because I know what Sergeant Morrill, how his heart is and how he polices and his beliefs and what he's trying to accomplish by supervising the SRO program. From my perspective, we need to have this relationship. Relationships, in my opinion, are the conduit of influence and developing understanding. So every question that's come up, every concern that's come up, I want to be receptive. I want to be present. That's why we're here tonight, to answer those questions. And words do matter. Words from the community, words from you, questions that come up. And we're an open book. I'm glad we have several members of the community here to see this dialogue, to see this discussion. That's how business gets done, how good things happen. So I'm all in on this as well. I appreciate our relationship. Even sometimes when we don't agree on certain things, we always can find perspective, which is wonderful. So that's why we're here tonight. So let's get down to business. I'm excited.
Colleagues on the board, what I'm going to do is just kind of swing around the table, and Sharon, I'm going to put you on the spot and let you kind of go first of anything you want to talk through. It's almost like the white elephant gift exchange. If you want to pass and say, I want to pass and go first, you can kick it to Leanne. I'll end with you. But otherwise, we'll start with you, and we'll give everyone 10 minutes to kind of ask. You don't need to take the whole 10 minutes, but you've got it. And then if we've still got things at the end, we can come back and talk through additional items as well. The floor is yours.
I only have a few opening comments at the present time. I'd like to hear some more dialogue from my colleagues specifically on the MOU. I think it's well known that I am one of the original supporting board members of the SROs in our district. I believe the program is in partnership with the police department, and you wear maybe 3 or more, you have many more roles, you know, the law role, the education role, but I truly, I look at this as a partnership. And it's evolved over time. And I think today we're trying to reconcile what is it the district would like, and, you know, and how can we come together in a more meaningful way for the students. So those are my comments, and I'll pass.
President Chesapeake, did you want me to respond to it all, or just
you? 100%. This is meant to be a conversation. So I would say free flowing is completely fine.
Perfect. Well, I share that same perspective about where we can take this. I look at where is our shared vision, where are our common goals. Something that Dr. Means and I've talked about at length. We want to have a safe environment for students. We want to have a safe environment for the teachers so they can do their job. We're not there to be patrolling around, and law enforcement is part of policing, but it's not the only part. That's one of the things that I've been trying to dispel as a bias or a perspective of what this uniform and what this badge stands for. We're there to keep the school safe, to work with the school staff, to work with the security director. So the kids want to come to school, so they want to learn, so staff feel safe, so they feel they can do their job, not to be overbearing.
If I could just comment too on the MOU itself. So this has been a work in progress for many years. Believe it or not, we've been trying to take another department's drafts, their policies, procedures, sort of blended it. But one thing we've done more with this, and I think it's the reason you guys have more questions, is because we didn't use a cookie cutter MOU and say, this is how the SROs are paid, this is where their office will be, and here's the contract between the school district and police department. We went much further, and that's why the MOU is a little bit deeper and talks about how, what do we do with it? There's a serious crime in the school, a sexual assault or something that's going on where sometimes traditionally everyone with the best interest in mind of the student handles things differently. So sometimes we've stepped on the school district's toes, and sometimes the school district has stepped on our toes. So we actually put documentation together with plans and even cheat sheets for principals to look at as to how we believe these cases should be handled. And again, that's open for discussion. We understand that. But for the partnership, we want this to work because traditionally we've done this for many, many years. And there's been police officers, myself included, have been upset about how things were handled. There's been principals, superintendents prior to this gentleman that have been upset how things were handled. And it's because we didn't have the clear-cut MOU. So I'm glad that it's here, and I'm glad that you guys have questions regarding it, but it's bigger than your typical MOU.
I think one piece of it too is that this codifies what's an administrative school violation versus a violation of ordinance and law. We have different areas of responsibility in this relationship, and we need to be talking about this. That's where I think the discretion of that SRO, that talented, very highly trained SRO, can work with school staff. We want to keep kids out of the criminal justice system. They do have to be held accountable for their behavior if it's something that's disruptive to the school or an ordinance violation or a law violation. But that's where officers can utilize that discretionary piece to figure out what is the best course of action. That's where we need to have, I guess, more perspective of each other's framework, the disciplinary framework, the administrative side, but also the criminal justice side.
So I would just also like to say thank you for being here. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Borrell for a long time. And I liked the fact that my kids knew who you were. And at the same time, they didn't spend a lot of time with you. And so the thing I want to start with is a statement, then I've got a question. So the statement is, I grew up in a military household, so rules, procedures, consequences were all very clear. And I think when we do a disservice to students and families when we don't have that clarity of what you can expect, and that there's the need for consistency so that everybody is having the same experience regardless of their age or their race or whatever their identity is that you want to throw in there. And I think the last couple of weeks, last year, whatever time frame you want to put on it, I think it's been really hard because kids have seen and families have felt like there is a lack of consistency, and that kids don't know necessarily what's going to happen when they do something. And we've sort of hit this crisis point. So my question for you all, because we've received so many versions of this and there's so many opinions on this, my question to both you all and Dr. Means is, what are the things that are currently required by DPI to use the Fund 80 money that are not currently captured within the MOU? And are they sort of disagreements in terms of whose job that really is, or are they philosophical? I'm wondering if you all can illuminate that a little bit, because I think the use of Fund 80 is a priority just in terms of us being good financial stewards. And at the same time, I'm curious, what are those things that might be holding us back that I lack clarity on?
I can take this one, Dr. Means. Dr. Means sent over correspondence about Fund 80 and some of the requirements, concerns. We're not there to provide school security. We're there as police officers. That's another differentiation I think that needs to be made. People say, well, you provide security? No, we're police officers. We're there to do that policing component, which again is multifaceted. Law enforcement, trust building, relationship building, those kinds of things. The job description agreement, the jurisdiction of this position is not confined within the walls of the schools. You'll see our SROs out there doing community engagement events. They're out working at football games, parades, those kinds of things. It also states that we have to work with service groups, churches, municipal teams, local businesses, parochial schools. Our SROs do all that. They do. The work schedule, this position is not limited to the work hours of the school day. And I can attest that my SROs are working all the time, a lot of times on overtime. When we're not dealing with our own internal shift shortages where they're covering a regular shift. They're great team players. Getting back to Fund 80, students reach out to individuals on and off school property. That has been a consistent component of the SRO job, is that they develop those relationships. I can tell you one circumstance where there was a congregation of kids at Whitman and West, and the older kids at West were going to meet up with their younger siblings over at Whitman. And one of the school staff members said, "Hey, SRO, there's something going on over here. Looks like there might be a fight. See something, say something." The SRO went over and said, "Hey, these are kids that are related to one another. There's nothing going on here." And the staff member was like, "Oh, this is great. That's one of those resources where they develop those relationships between the schools over time." And there's a concerted effort to document this as a community-wide program. That's something that, as Sergeant Morrill had been working on this MOU even before I got sworn in, we recognize our own need to do better tracking of not just the quantitative components of it, but the qualitative components of it. That has been shored up, where we do the non-contact tracking as well, where if we talk to a kid, a young person in one of the schools, and just give them some guidance or say, "Hey, let's go to the social worker in the school or the guidance counselor," we need to document that. That's a qualitative component. It's not a metric for a citation or an arrest. That's something that we recognize as something that we need to do a better job of. The other side of it, if one of the SROs intervenes, finds somebody, for example, a kid smoking in the bathroom, and uses their discretion to say, "Hey, I'm not going to issue the citation to you, but I'm giving you a warning. If this happens again, you're going to get a citation." But that's also informing school staff, making the notification to the parent. That's how that SRO role fits in this. There's also 10 different requirements on here. In reviewing the district's needs for SROs, it'd be favorable to following tasks or additions. Dr. Means, I'll go through them if that's okay.
Before you do,
Yeah, please.
So those are the requirements for Fund 80.
Okay,
That's it.
that's it. Okay.
And so I think the last component that the chief didn't mention is that we have to document all of these different items and make it available to our financial auditors.
Okay.
So the financial auditor will come in annually and say, "You're using Fund 80. Can you prove to us how you're utilizing Fund 80 in a community service way?"
Okay.
And so that documentation is going to really be important for us to tighten it up and to make it very clear. But once we do it, then the auditors will be able to come in and say, we are able to justify this to the Department of Public Instruction that you're using Fund 80 appropriately. So those are the components.
Another example, I went over to a parochial school to meet the principal to talk about how can you shore up your security, making sure the doors are locked and what type of security procedures, or like an active assailant drill. I referred that principal over to our community service sports specialist, the team of Laurel Orishki, some of our community support officers. So that work can also continue, but it has to be documented. Even if I'm going out there, if I stop by Tulsa West to check on my officers, check in with the principal, have that interaction, that has to be documented too. That, yeah, we are having this FaceTime, we are talking about critical issues and problem solving.
Is that language in the MOU draft? That language that those encounters will be documented?
That's part of the documentation piece under Fund 80. That's something we've done procedurally to change it.
Sure, but I think what I'm asking is, because we've never historically had an MOU with the police department, correct? Like never in the history of the district and the department. So is that language in the MOU saying that those occurrences will be documented?
In what I would say is I think there was a draft that was done in June. The Fund 80 alignment conversation has been happening since then. And so now it will be documented in the MOU. Is it like, have we seen the current draft? No.
Okay, that's what.
So this is
the draft we have is not.
What the draft we have is very much a working draft from kind of, I think, probably from May. So our goal tonight is to figure out what things need to do, the wordsmithing of it, the inclusion of it, that will happen with the district administrative team and the police department, and then it'll come back to us.
Okay.
So this is literally kind of like our conversation around what's in there, what's not. And the Fund 80 piece is one of those things that has kind of emerged as something we need to shore up from when the last draft came forward to now.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
If I can add a little context to that too. When we call out a call for service that goes into our computer-aided dispatch system, that's not a good place to house it. So Sergeant Morrill and I talked about this probably the second month we being here. I said, well, why don't we keep it on the school system server? That we do have those documented calls in our shell inside the computer-aided dispatch system. But why not put it on some resource on the school system server so you have internal transparency? You can see what we're doing. I'm perfectly fine with that. I promised you transparency. Why not put it there? So that's, I think, an ask, and I don't think it's an unreasonable ask. It's something I would absolutely promote.
I think just to comment on that further, so the spreadsheet that we put together with the data of contacts with students and statistics for you guys, if you notice, every one of those pieces of data starts with a police call number. What you don't see is the stuff that we're doing behind the scenes. For example, that the reprimand and release, or we turn them over to a parent, or Chief used an example of someone smoking in the bathroom, or we maybe not use some discretion. We turn it over to the principal, make contact with parents. What the SROs do is that they wear multiple hats in the school district. And one of those hats is the dispatcher. They're actually a dispatcher, because if something happens in a community call, police dispatch, a call numbers automatically generated. Whether they take action or not, they're tasked with entering notes into our system so we know what occurred. As an SRO, what we learned and what I learned in my first year, I called for everything. Dispatcher said, you're driving me crazy, quit calling so much, right? So what we do, or what we've been doing as SROs, is we'll be that dispatcher, get some information that something's occurred in the school. It could be petty theft or something, for example. The SRO will then sort of investigate, speak with the students, speak with the administrators, maybe even call parents. And if they determine that this isn't no legal action will be taken, then they oftentimes, almost always, won't call dispatch for a call number to document that incident. Now, I used to keep a spreadsheet of all my contacts regardless, because my memory isn't the best. So it helped me remember I had a contact with that kid 3 years ago. I don't know why. I could look at my spreadsheets now. It wasn't a legal matter. It was something we dealt with and turned over to a parent. So some kept better records than others. Now we're asking them to use that same spreadsheet that you guys have. It's a live document that's being filled in as the SROs continue about their day. Each day, our plan is to move on for the remainder. If they have those contacts that don't result in the police contact, they're going to document that regardless. And I'm even guilty. I went and spoke to St. Jude's, and I did a safety presentation for them. That's technically, I'm not a school resource officer, but it's affiliated with the school. What Fund 80 is driving at, really, I should document that I did that. So we have to get better at that. That's why the statistics you have don't show all the multiple contacts that the officers have where they didn't take any police action. So if you look at the stats and say, oh my gosh, all they do is arrest or cite somebody. We do all kinds of things we just didn't document.
And that's where we need to improve internally our qualitative versus quantitative. I can give you the quantitative of citations and arrests, but those other types of contacts are just as important. So getting back to Fund 80, conduct daily exterior school campus checks. Situational awareness training, it's something that I would offer if there is some type of staff in service. I look at it as a force multiplier. One SRO can only do so much. When we drive up to the school, we drive around, we do an external school campus check or security survey, if you will. We're always doing that as part of our profession. We're always sizing up the room and sizing up what's going on. Not to make school staff paranoid, that's not our goal. It's to be situationally aware. So you can recognize those environmental clues that, hey, something might be escalating, and then I can use de-escalation tactics as a staff member. It's something that I think we could do going forward. Number 2 is assist with traffic coordination. We do that every day. School kids, parents dropping their kids off, or kids driving to school, and then when they leave. Strategically and continually collaborate with the district school safety coordinator, conducting threat assessment drills, tabletop drills, and with the principal and the building crisis team. I don't know, Sergeant Morrill, you'll have to speak to that. I know we have a good relationship with Ms. Geisler.
Absolutely. And we
talking about those things.
We work with her, the standard response protocol, which is the safety thing that we're using in the schools. We work with on that. We present to the staff members on and on. We are discussing tabletop exercises. I think those are a very good resource. There's always ways we can expand. This year we were hoping to, we ran out of time with the school starting and the end of basically summer to put together a large scale training where we would offer and work with all of you and your teachers and staff and do actually like an active shooter training, hopefully in a school building. Dr. Means has been open to that moving forward. So next year we plan to put that together and do that type of training. So yes, there's multiple trainings we want to do and some that we currently do.
And I also get the fact that doing that type of training can be very scary for both staff and for students, but that's the world we live in nowadays about doing age appropriate type of training, staff level appropriate, because it's different for elementary level school kids versus teenagers. That's something that's in several of the department members' wheelhouse. So that's something we'll continue our work on with the district school safety coordinator. And reviewing safety protocols with a specific school in collaboration with the district safety coordinator, be present for emergency drills. That's part of what we do. Those are ongoing objectives. Based on the specific training of the SRO provides service to the schools in the areas, but are not limited to conflict resolution, ATODA, and other specialized training. My understanding, we do this already as part of the SRO curriculum. I know there's been discussion about further training for the SROs. And that's something that I talked to Sergeant Morrill about, is figuring out where do we have those redundancies? Because SROs are specially trained. They go through a lot of training and ongoing training. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Sergeant Morrill.
Well, I honestly, I think you covered it. Dr. Means has asked for, in the MOU, we have some specific training that school district provided by the school district. In the MOU, we've put that in there. We definitely agree to, having the SROs do that training along with you as well. So we're constantly trained, and just from the law enforcement perspective, we have to be just to stay certified. So there's that in addition to the extra stuff, and then certainly being present for the school stuff as well.
I only have a few more to go, Mr. Bailey. Sorry.
She's way over her time.
I know.
We're going right after this to Mr. Meyer.
I'll be brief. I serve some of my time.
Serve as the immediate contact in the case of emergency for the district instead of calling 911. There are some things that are just appropriate to call 911. With the use of technology, having handheld radios, school radios, has increased the security capacity of the SROs to have that instant communication. If you call 911, that's the best way to notify in the event of emergency. But I can cite several circumstances where the SROs, people call 911 or they alert school administration, they call 911, but the SRO already knows and they're responding over there already because of radio or because there's cell phone availability.
And you guys benefit, forgive me if that's what you're trying to say, that the school district provided radios for our police officers. So we have our own radios and we also have school district radios. So we have access to, and we're always on the emergency channel. So if something happens that, Longfellow and you're at Whitman, you're going to know there's a crisis. Oftentimes before 911's even called, the officers are responding, thanks to you guys providing those radios.
Number 8, assisting and extending last chance agreements to students in lieu of distribution of actual citations and arrests to reduce the school to prison pipeline. So I'm going to unpack this. It's a little complex. When it comes to administrative rule violations and violation of ordinance and law, we're there to be keepers of the peace. When it becomes an administrative sanction by the school, that's your wheelhouse. We're there as keepers of the peace. But we can add additional context of what we have as far as relationship building, what we've experienced. As far as the school to prison pipeline, I've looked at the research. Divesting from school policing. I read this article about that topic, and I don't think it's an issue in Wauwatosa because I've said it time and time again, our SROs, we're trying to keep young people out of the criminal justice system. This topic came up at council talking about decriminalization of THC. And I'm asking the council, they're actually meeting on it tonight. My captain is over to discuss it. It gives officers that discretion versus an all or nothing, where we can make it an ordinance violation. I bring up the example, if there's a young person in the parking lot at one of the high schools and they get found with some THC in their possession, giving the officers the discretion to write a citation versus making it a state charge. It's technically a felony, to be in possession of controlled substance within 1,000 feet of a school. I don't want kids. We're there to keep them out of there, to make them into productive adults in their developmental stages of life, not to insert them in the criminal justice system. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we have to do that.
Sir, if I might,
Please.
There's an instance where when I was at Tulsa East, we had two students who were, one was 17, one was 16, and they were caught having sex in a hallway and underneath the stairs. Became a major issue. Now, kids under the age of 18 can't consent to anything, but they can do something willingly. So boyfriend, girlfriend, right? But technically, in the eyes of the law, they've committed a crime. They were caught by a school official, and we have suddenly a crime. We have a sexual assault that's occurred in the school between basically two consenting students. So I'm tasked with, I have to do something with this. Can't write a ticket for that. That's a crime that has occurred. However, when I handled that situation, I did something outside of the box and wasn't even sure how that was going to fly with the DA's office. But I sent the case down to the DA's office. The boy who's 17 would be considered an adult. So he would be charged as an adult for a sexual offense and be labeled a sexual offender. I looked at the totality of the circumstances and thought, this is probably not the best path for this young man nor his family. So I sent that down to the DA's office. I refused to arrest this individual. And normally when you send a case to the DA's office, someone has to be arrested. And I called the DA and I spoke with them at length about it. So here are the circumstances. I know you're going to review it, and my gut tells me you're probably going to no process this case. But I also know you need it to come across your desk. If you guys charge the case, I will then go backwards and arrest him. But right now, I don't want to put that on this kid because it'll follow him the rest of his life, even if it's dismissed. And so that's a pretty shining example, not trying to say pat myself on the back and try to say the SROs do those kinds of things to avoid that school to prison pipeline. And in that case, it worked out to our benefit. The DA just documented that it occurred. All parents were brought in. There were no charges, and the case was dismissed. That was the end of it. So another example of trying to avoid, going all in and just following the letter of the law as opposed to maybe the spirit of the law.
And that's officer using discretion, using the tools, and it's perfectly legal. It's called an order in. It's something that we do in law enforcement versus having to take that person into custody. So when we put handcuffs on somebody, there's a decision-making process there as well. Leverage SROs to secure external social services for students and families in need. I've said this before, especially with what's happening with COVID. I understand the situation going on with teachers and with students and that additional stress that's happened over the last couple of years. I was a very big advocate that TOSA, a verbal advocate, that additional social work help was also offered, but not at the detriment or pulling SROs out of the schools. I think there needs to be that relationship so both aspects are being covered. And being present in school events where an anticipated large volume of people will be in attendance, that's happening already. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. So it sounds like all the Fund 80 things are covered and more. Are there any things that are not covered that we'd like to see happening that you're not seeing captured there?
No.
Okay. So it sounds like we're really getting there in terms of what's.
If I can interject something, I know there was a concern about having officers wear a soft uniform at all times.
Oh, wait, don't steal my thunder.
Oh,
I want to ask about that later.
Too late.
President Anger, if you want me to wait.
No.
So I ended up responding back that actually this is a very essential tool for police officers. It's a visible display of our authority, but officers need to have that discretion where a staff member, an administrator may say, hey, Sergeant Morrill, can you come to school tomorrow? Because we have this event going on. Can you wear the soft uniform? But our go-to is to wear this, but also have that discretion. And I don't want to arbitrarily say, no, officers, you have to be in soft uniform versus the physical police uniform. It's a visible display of authority. The first day of school, I saw my SROs out there. They were all in uniform. I was out there in uniform. Make people safe. Yes, they see that the police are out there. It's not appropriate at that time to be wearing a soft uniform. That's why I didn't want to take away, and I won't take away that discretion from the police officers to make that decision. Or for an administrator to call Sergeant Morrill and say, hey, we have this event coming up, having that back and forth type of relationship.
I'm going to hold on my second question.
Sorry, President, just a banger.
No, that's okay. I'll come back.
May I?
Yeah.
So I have one big question, and I think I'm in agreement with what the draft says on this topic, but there is disagreement from the community. And I want to first be sure that I'm understanding correctly. And second, I want to try to address the disagreement from the community. People might not be happy with the outcome depending upon what happens. But my question has to do with the SRO interviewing students about when the parent is notified. And I'm going to frame this up to say, Mike Meyer in this chair, I'm wearing the hat of the school board member. And I am not wearing the hat of the parent. I am not wearing the hat of defense counsel. I am not wearing the hat of the SRO. So, well, what does that mean? That means that I want to keep schools safe. And I want students to have the best journey possible through our schools. So if there's going to be questioning going on, I want the least possible number of arrests. I'm going to distinguish between you can arrest as compared to you should arrest. And for me, and for my opinion, I want the should arrest to be as narrowly tailored as possible so that if there's any other reasonable path to put this student on, we can take it. And that arrest is only where we really have to keep everybody safe. Now, if I'm wearing the parent hat, I'm going to say, well, you know, it depends on the situation. I had somebody who was a minor that I was responsible for in a car accident, and I showed up on the scene and the person kept saying it was my fault. It was my fault. Don't say that anymore. You know, just let's let the process figure it out. But on the other hand, if my child has got involved in something and might know something that could help save, you know, other people from injury or death or you know, great harm, I hope my parent hat would say, you know what, my child, we need you to talk to the police here. Okay. Now, if I did once long ago as a student attorney defend, I represented a defendant in a criminal case, and as a staffer on a law enforcement advisory committee for a section of the state, I recommended attorneys at the jailhouse door, and local judges weren't happy with me on that recommendation. But I'm not a defense lawyer here wearing that hat. Yes, I believe people should have lawyers. There's civil rights and constitutional rights, but that's not my job here. That's a job that has to be done, but it's not my job here. Just like it's not my job to decide when to arrest, that's your job. So I'm not going to wear any of those hats. So what I need to know is somehow what's your approach? And you've kind of explained it about the two teenagers in the stairwell. There's going to be times where as a school board member, I'm going to hope you did get a chance to ask questions to the young person before the person with the parent hat or the lawyer hat got on the scene, because it might save somebody's life. And that's my concern and my wish. So can you, if you have any more to expound upon that about, the police questioning the student and when the parent is notified and under what circumstances would you feel a should question before the parent is notified, as opposed to, well, we would like to, but we're not going to. Can you help us with that?
Sure. We're obligatory reporters as well. When we take somebody into custody, we have, under law, we have to make that notification to the parents. When we conduct some type of custodial interview of somebody, that's not the point, because they may end up walking out the door. I sent some correspondence to the board about that. So we had clarity that if it's an administrative rule violation, that's the school administration's purview. We're not going to get involved in that as other than be keepers of the peace. If we have to make an arrest, we're going to try and be respectful, be discreet about it as much as we can. We also have to weigh out the need for putting the handcuffs in the school versus outside of the school. I'm sure that's a question broiling in people's minds. The vision or the ideology of the perp walk, no, that doesn't apply in an SRO or in a school environment. In fact, we want to be very discreet about it. And you know as well as I do, in a school, word travels fast among students and people play fill in the blank. That's where that relationship piece and having that trust between school administrators and the SROs is so important. So we know where our lane is in this, depending on the circumstance, obviously, if it's a crime or if it's a school sanction. I don't know, Jim, do you want to expound upon that?
So there's a couple of times when there's several reasons we talk to students. If we're talking with a victim, for example, we will, outside of some unusual circumstances, and I always go, let's think about a sexual assault or something like that. We're talking to a victim, where if there's some reason that the parent might be implicated in maybe having something to do with that sexual assault, in other words, that they are sexually abusing their child, or they're exposing that child to do something to where that victim is being further victimized by a parent, we definitely don't want to contact the parent. But 9 times out of 10, if we're talking to a victim in a school, the parent is welcome to be there. We'll tell them we're going to be talking to your child. If we're talking to a complainant, we don't have an issue with that. Where we run into the biggest problem is when we're talking with suspects of a crime, not of a school violation, something that rises to the level of a crime. In those circumstances, we have the right to talk to a juvenile without a parent present legally. So if I have a 16-year-old that's breaking into a car right now in the parking lot, I can go out there and detain that juvenile. I can ask them investigatory questions, and I can take that person into custody, and I can bring them to the station. And once they get to the station, I can call mom and dad and say, guess what? They're here. And the mom or dad still doesn't have the right to come in now and say, now I want to see my child. You have them in custody. I demand to see them. They're not allowed to legally. They can't do it. They can't invoke rights for their child. They can't say the Fifth Amendment. I want a lawyer. My kid, I want to tell my kid not to talk. We need a lawyer. They can't do those things. That's hardcore. That's the nature of it all. We don't do that. We try our best. If we're interviewing a suspect, we like to have, generally speaking, if there's a suspect of a crime that's occurred in a school, the school has a vested interest in knowing all the details that's going on with that crime, because they have a responsibility to either suspend somebody or potentially expel them, or at the very least have some sort of a disciplinary hearing. They want that information and they want it quickly. So we try to do those things in front of administrator, but there are times where something rises to the level of a crime and the school doesn't want us to talk to the child, and it's a criminal act has occurred. We can just exercise our authority and say, well, we'll just take the kid with us, and we will let the parents know when we get to the station, or you're welcome to call as we're leaving to let them know, because you guys are basically the parents while the parents are away. So I guess to answer your question, the first part of your question is, we do have the right to talk to juveniles. We have the right to investigate things without a parent present. And then we can take it even further if we need to, but we always try to notify parents immediately. Well, we will absolutely if we take them into custody. So that we have that option.
I have one thing to add to that, Mr. Meyer, that again, you said it, that we're there to protect the rights of all people, victims, suspects. I explained what Miranda is, where when we go into that, we're taking you into custody. We've got to be very careful, because we've got to protect the rights of that individual. We also have to protect ourselves too, because if we do it wrong, we could be subject to legal sanctions as well. And it's a very delicate line we've got to walk, but the SROs are trained, police officers are trained to do that delicate walk.
So if we have you, the officers in the building, you don't stop wearing your police officer hat. Just like, if we had legal aid office in the building, though, they wouldn't ever stop wearing their lawyer hat. So there's nothing here that as a board member I can address about you wearing your hat. You're supposed to wear your hat and you'll do that job. I am comfortable that you are Wauwatosa community police officers and you think like Wauwatosans. And so that has to be enough, for me when I vote. And it is enough. So, I'm going to have to, if we let you in the building on this agreement basis, you can, of course, to enforce the law, you have various duties and rights to go places that we can't tell you not to, but if we agree to this, we're, agreeing to some level of trust in that you're a member of our community, and I can sleep at night with that.
I think it's a
Trusting you.
codification of our relationship.
Yes.
Because as you said, police officers can come in the building. It's a public building. That's not about forcing our authority. It's about really codifying our relationship, that we're working towards that same vision about having schools be safe so teachers can do their job, students can learn. That's really what that codifies.
I would just respectfully ask the board and the community to review policy 5540.
So I have that.
Under clause B, it talks about interview procedures. So as a board, while the MOU is one component of this conversation, you have already dictated and framed what the interview procedures are for any law enforcement officer. It's very, I think it's unique language, and I'll stop there.
I think, I know you want to talk. Can I get one more point in,
Oh,
please?
yeah, of course.
Thank you. I'll forget it. This is important. I think, just for clarity's sake, you can argue, and there scholars could argue this is, when has custody occurred, right? If we're talking to a student, are they technically in custody? There's the free to leave test, basically. If I'm in plain clothes and the chief's talking to me, do I feel like I can walk out? Maybe not, because he's the chief and he's wearing his uniform. And so we are careful with that too. So when we talk to students and they are free to leave, generally an SRO will tell them immediately, you're free to leave. You do not have to answer my questions. We even document in our reports. There was 2 people in the room. There was a school administrator. There was myself. I was in full uniform. I sat away from the door so that I wasn't blocking the door in any way. I told the student they're free to leave. So we absolutely established that. And when we do that is when we're going to ask some investigatory questions that we haven't necessarily Mirandized for, but we're kind of digging around to see, has a crime been committed or not? Where are we going with this? We might have the wrong kid. We don't know exactly what's going on just yet. So that's where we do that. Then there's another area where it's between that free to leave and questioning and custody, and that's a detainment. So if I have reason to believe that a crime is about to be committed or has been committed, I have the right to stop anybody on the street or in the school or anywhere else and detain them and say, hold on a second. I want to make sure that you're not the bad guy who's about to go do something or who has just done something. I can detain you. You're not in custody, but you're being detained and you are being asked some questions about what happened. If it rises to the level that now I have probable cause, stop Dr. Means because the Xbox just got stolen on a Target. In the backseat of his car is a brand new Xbox, but a Target bag is up. There seems to be, there's some evidence. Maybe they say there's video of Dr. Means taking said Xbox. Now we have probable cause. It's risen to the level of, risen to the level of, we do have probable cause that crime has been committed. Now custody has occurred. I have you in custody. I can ask you questions till I'm blue in the face, but if you answer them all and you confess to killing somebody too, all of it's going to get thrown out the window because I didn't read you your rights at that point. So there's gray areas there. But the biggest thing is the investigatory piece of it. We have the right to ask questions. Otherwise, we would never know if a crime occurred, if there was an issue or not, because we can't talk to anyone.
And why I pointed out 5540 and why I indicated some of the language is interesting. Under number 2, under interview procedures, it states, if the principal concurs that the questioning is appropriate, ... So I would encourage the board members and community to read the language. That's a little contrary to what we just discussed here. It's putting the principal in a judgment call position. And so without the policy being definitive, that's the way the language currently reads.
And that's something we need to be very careful of, the administrative component of it. When it goes into the lane of policing or where we're doing that possible criminal investigation, that's where we have that authority to do that in private. I'm just saying what the law says, very specific about that.
And so we've talked about aligning our policies with the actual law. So it goes on to say under B2, if the principal concurs that is appropriate, the principal will send for the student, move into an unoccupied room, and if appropriate, and if a parent is not present, remain in the room during the questioning. So I think I would assume my experience in working with law enforcement, that may not align with how they want to proceed with interviewing and questioning. It's just something for you to ponder as we look at policy.
And I think it puts the principal or the administrator in sort of a bad spot if we don't fix that. However, we come to an agreement here, because we don't want to have them something against us or vice versa. But that's where we then, if that ever happens to the point where we absolutely disagree on that, then the police department will, in all honesty, just take the person into custody and take them off your property. But we don't want to butt heads with the school. We want to have the understanding that this is how it works and why. So I would agree that if you guys end up adopting that language, or if you need to adjust it, however that may be, that the policy aligns with it, so there's no confusion.
It puts the principals in a bad place, and we don't want to do that.
And that's our policy as written.
That's your current policy that was revised actually in 2012.
I have a question on this topic still. So the policy says, I think you're reading from the administrative guidelines, but it says
You're right.
that parents will be informed whenever their minor child is interviewed. So currently, as it stands, that's not the practice. So you're saying that you can interview children, because I think I guess what concerns me when you use language like generally, the SRO will tell the student you can leave, you're not being detained, but they don't always.
No, because the child might actually be in custody. And if that's the case, we'll tell them they're in custody.
Okay, but the difference is when they're being interviewed and so right now, as the practice is, the parent does not have to be informed when their minor child is interviewed.
That is correct. But we tell them, we do inform them regardless. If I have a conversation with a student that even rises to the level of a school consequence, we always touch base with the parents. Say, hey, just so you know, I talked to your kid today. So we do that.
So where my concern lies is if you're investigating marijuana on the property and another student that you're interviewing says, oh, actually I have some in my locker too, then are you, legally bound to then pursue that, criminal act? Well, where it might just be a student who, they just admitted something because they don't understand their rights. They don't understand the consequences.
Sure. But in the school, they have a lower level. We talked about probable cause where I need absolute. You probably did it. I have some factual evidence that says you did something. I can take you into custody for that. In the school, it's lower. It's reasonable suspicion. So if you say that you saw him in the bathroom selling a green leafy substance and got cash, I can probably reasonably suspect that it was a marijuana transaction. The school can then literally search him. The principal can search or can ask an SRO to search him based on that. If that happened across the street, we can't do it. The police can't do it. But the school has a lower expectation of privacy because they have a higher expectation of keeping kids safe from whether it be violence or drugs or whatnot. So it's a little bit different in the schools. And that's another thing that's hard for people to understand. And there's a lot of case law on that too. But we do always tell people when we talk to their kids. Okay.
It's something above and beyond just a casual conversation or interaction, where there could be an administrative sanction. That's the SRO's job, is to have that dialogue, because parents have, the biggest piece of this, we're not there to raise kids. We're there to keep them safe and make sure parents have the information so they can do their piece of it as well. And also talking to school staff members so we're all on the same sheet of music. Or why the discretionary decision was made to not write a citation or make an arrest. The other side of it.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer, you doubled your time.
Dr. Jessup Banger, I'll fall on my sword. I'm the one who's also.
I sent too much away. I know. So I'm gonna go through a bunch of different items that we've already talked about that were on my list. The training and support piece, I'm a big fan of. My context I come at this through is having worked much of my career on college campuses in conduct, where I've worked really closely with police. On a college campus, different context. So I'm kind of like navigating the over 18 generally. Police don't want to be involved at all unless they have to be. Like I've thought of all the protests we've staffed. They're always there. We're coordinating closely, but they're like, at the point the police are involved, we're off the rails. So I'm trying to think of this in a K-12 context versus that, and kind of muddle my way through of thinking about what partnerships look like in a higher ed context versus a K-12 context. So there's things that I might just be wrong on that I'm navigating in my head. The training and support piece I like a lot. I think anywhere we can have this component of a really well-trained staff, that we understand each other, and that we've given everyone all the tools they need to be successful. And I was really glad to hear that kind of we've come to a good place in landing on that piece. One of the concerns I had when we talked about this a while ago was the rotating SROs out of roles. And this may be one I'm probably not getting my way on, and I understand why you would want to rotate them out. The idea of, and I know she's retiring in December, but like the idea of Officer Tracy not being an SRO was hard for me to imagine after she spent so much time in my kids' schools and was the graduation speaker and a variety of other things. So I understand from your perspective why it's important. From my perspective, it's not essential that they don't transition out, but the time it takes to understand schools, relationships, build connections with kids, that stuff takes time. And so how we balance those things, there's not a answer to that, but I would love to kind of grapple with, this may not be in the MOU, but somewhere we grapple with how do we make sure that there's time in that the capital that's built up in developing relationships with kids. And I think it is different. It takes I'm going to guess a unique personality for each different type of police work. And working with adolescents, as a parent of an adolescent, I'm figuring this out, that it's a complicated endeavor. That is, I think, a learned skill. I'm really a big fan of the soft shell. And I will keep, this isn't a hill I'm dying on, but I think anytime we can get cool, I'm imagining folks in East Apparel, West Apparel, Longfellow, Whitman, Eisenhower, kind of everything else. And I'm happy to put a budget and a line item in the budget to make sure that we're helping supply those. But I would love to see that whenever we can. I get that that's not always, there's a time and a place, but I would love for that to be considered wherever we can. I would love to find ways for the district to be involved in hiring and evaluation of officers, not as primary, but as inputs, so that there's feedback loops. Mr. Phillips is one of my colleagues who we can't get through a meeting without him saying something about a feedback loop, and kind of continuous learning and improvement. And I would love for that to be a component. Again, I'm not expecting a principal to be co-supervising an SRO, but wherever we can have those feedback loops, for me, that's important. And I think it will help the program get better and improve. Who's involved in that? I'm actually, in my mind, I was like, where does if students are in strands, I don't even know if there is a strand for launch of law enforcement. But of creative ways for students could be learning some of these things and wrapping in. And again, some things are appropriate, some are not, but I would love some creative thinking about how we can do that. I think the Fund 80 alignment stuff, I was really glad to hear all that. All the other kind of components I was excited about. Engagement in athletic events is top of mind for me right now. I want to keep working through the clarity and investigations. My experience in working with police is that there are very different roles for administrative responses to behaviors. And there's a different level of, we're operating from a preponderance. And in the criminal system, you have a higher threshold. So it's all the different tools that we can use and resources we can use, and making sure that the MOU has components that speak to these both, so that we are working in concert. And this is messy. There's personalities involved in it. No matter what we have in the MOU, when you get to the situation, you're like, oh, we hadn't foreseen this one. So I think whatever we can add in, I would love to see. I love the stuff about internal data tracking. One of the components that I was involved in when I was working at Colorado State with several of officers is I would go into middle schools and high schools with members of it was the Colorado State University and the Poudre City of Fort Collins Police, and we would do a lot of training on peer sexual assault, how to interrupt things that are going sideways in different ways.
Like bystander stuff.
Bystander intervention. Those are things that I would love to be able to offer to students and families. And that, again, doesn't have to be in an MOU, but I think fits some of the community education component. And that's one of the things I wanted to mention I think that work can be really important. It was a fun way to work and do some stuff and get to work with some of the adolescent populations. the one thing that I'm struggling with is, and when I've talked to folks, is the interviewing of minors. And this is, I think we all have different views on this. I find myself uncomfortable. And part of this is I never, even if I would have known, I would have never walked out if there was a principal. This is my German Lutheran elementary school upbringing. I would never have walked out. Even if you would have said 10 times, you can walk out, you don't have to talk to me. I would never have not talked to a police officer. And I find myself uneasy with the idea of not engaging families in those conversations. With the caveat, there's things where there's an immediate crisis, concern, safety, well-being that I would always carve out. But I do find myself uncomfortable with that. Maybe I'll always be uncomfortable with it, but that's the one where I'm stuck. And part of it is I'm looking at through my lens. And every single time I ever did anything wrong, I got caught. And I was generally a pretty good kid. But I remember on 2 different occasions, police showed up at my house. One involved a water balloon slingshot, bad decision-making on my part. And the other one was a Carmex bottle that wasn't my fault. It was a friend in the backseat and I yelled at him. But both times I remember my parents being there and I was totally honest. I totally straightforward, not arrested, still got to go to college and do everything else. But how terrifying it was. And for me, I keep thinking, I really am going to be more comfortable with parents involved. And I don't know what the nuance is there, but I would ask that we kind of sit down and think about, are there models that we can look at that don't impede your ability to keep schools safe? And that was one when parents are like, I got a lot of questions of like, are you getting rid of SROs? And I'm like, not that I'm aware of. And I was like, here's like the 4 things that I'm concerned about. This is the one where they were like, yeah, of course. Like universally, people are like, they would like to be involved if their kids get in trouble. They would like to be involved and engaged. And for me, it's the parents should know and be engaged because they have some parenting to do. 2, hopefully they're partnering, and I know this isn't always the case, hopefully they're partnering with the schools, with social workers, with police, that we're kind of rallying around saying, something's gone awry here. Let's figure out what's going on. And there's just me wanting to do all we can to make sure that we're building those relationships. So that's the one, based on my set of life experiences, that I'm struggling with. And nothing you're saying is making me feel better. And it's not that I don't trust you, but I'm just worried about kids who, no matter what you say, thinking about Eric as a 13-year-old or an 8-year-old, I wouldn't have been hearing all that. I would have just been like, I'm just going to do whatever you say. I'm really scared. Whatever you tell me, I'm going to do exactly. I may not even know if I'm telling you the truth. I'm just going to tell you everything I said, everything anybody's ever done wrong. You didn't ask the question. I'm telling you everything. That's what I'm struggling with. Sure. So, and I don't have the answer to it, but I would love for kind of, as you all and Dr. Means kind of sit down, and if there's models and stuff, that's what I would ask, that one is the one that's a sticking point.
So Ms. Willis is absolutely correct. It's the administrative guideline, but it is, I would encourage everyone to read B. It's very clear. So at some point, a board of education in this district has clarified how they want administrators at the school level to engage. It even goes down to the point of if a police officer, let's just assume from West Bend, wants to interview one of our students. That happens a lot, right? It happens a lot where a student did something in a different municipality, but they know that the kid goes to Wauwatosa West or Wauwatosa East. They'll call the police in Wauwatosa and say, we want to interview Damon. The way that this guideline reads right now, it places the principal in the middle of it. And it also clearly states that if that interview is to take place, the police department has to contact a school resource officer, the way that the language reads right now, which I think that's unique language to me. In past administrative experiences, the SRO is involved, the police just come in. And then it goes on to talk about the role of the administrator through that process. So I think you're going to have to reconcile that administrative guideline. And I think it also gets to the issue of how we write policy versus administrative guidelines. As I read these guidelines, it reads like a policy. And so you'll have to determine if you want to move that over to policy or keep it in guidelines.
So what are the chances, and I'll ask this to you both, that you will, and I won't use the right word, so correct me, that you will have to detain or remove a student because you could not talk to them?
I'll take this one, Jim. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Jessup Anger. The first piece of this, it has to be an age appropriate. The officer has to show that the person that they're talking to understands that they're in custody. Otherwise, we're technically violating that person's rights. So we've got to show that the person that we asked questions, do you understand why you're here? Do you understand why I'm talking to you? And if that person doesn't have that cognitive ability or that level of understanding, that's when we hit the phone and say, hey, parent, there's something, I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarge. We've got to show that proof.
You mentioned 8-year-old Eric. We're not gonna, that interview or interrogation is gonna be completely different than it would be with, say, 16-year-old Eric.
Yeah.
Right? Because so we recognize their cognitive abilities where they are as far as, being a little kid or an older kid. So that has an impact on how that conversation goes or what parent we're going to contact. Now, if we're talking about someone that has a gun in their backpack or something, if they're 8 years old, I mean, we might handle it a little bit differently. So we do look at all circumstances. The law book, if you look at the statute book, the black and white pages, they're not. It's gray. It's gray for a reason because there's way too many things that could come in and influence how something is done. So a lot of people want cut and dry. Here it is in policy. Here's what it says. Here's what we're doing. And law enforcement, we have to think outside the box constantly. So those are examples of that. I think there's a misconception amongst adults. Certainly in the public, we see it, and obviously seeing it here in the schools. Law enforcement has a right to interview, interrogate, take into custody a juvenile without parental permission. And I think that's a stumbling block we're hitting here because if, let's say, the SROs are out of here tomorrow, I'm not saying that they are, but
Just to clarify the community,
that's not the case.
that's not discussion.
So let's use that example. And you call the police because something's occurred on campus. When you have the road cop show up, they're not interested in sitting down with an administrator or calling mom and dad or looking at video or taking a little bit of time talking to extra kid here, extra kid there, maybe, hearing about the student's history from a social worker or whatnot. They're saying, who is the problem? You come with me. And they will take them out of there immediately.
Conversely, though, that another officer from, like you cited, West Bend, I can only speak to what our officers do and how they handle business. But I get that that's a concern too. If somebody is a non-Wauwatosa resident, they live in another jurisdiction, something happens, let's say in Milwaukee or West Allis, and that officer comes over, I would recommend you codify in policy that, hey, my policy here in the school says we got to notify the Wauwatosa SRO and we would act as that liaison. I don't think that happens very frequently. It does happen occasionally.
It doesn't
better than I do.
It doesn't happen often, and we've always tried to be the liaison for that department. And they usually contact us, and we talk to the administrator and say, "Here's what's going on." What we've tried to avoid is using the school as a convenient place to come talk to a suspect in any crime. Because especially if it's an ordinance violation or even a minor crime, we don't want to just have, well, guess what? Junior will be in school tomorrow. We'll just go pick him up there and disrupt the school day, disrupt him out of his class. That is not good for anybody. So our policies and procedures have always been, if we will make efforts outside of the school day, if a crime that has been committed outside of the school, something that happened in the community, but the suspect is in the school, we don't just go to the school and go get that suspect. We always try it at their home. We'll try it at their place of work. We might wait outside out that school. We try not to just go into the school. The only time we would do that is if it's a very serious issue where we have someone who's caused a very serious crime or they're a threat to the community. They've made a threat to do something to the school, shoot somebody, do that kind of thing. And suddenly safety is a priority. So we're like, well, we're going to have to come in today. But other agencies, it's rare that they come in and we act as a liaison for them. So they don't come in and try to strong arm an administrator who's looking at their policy saying, no, this isn't how we do it. And then suddenly they're talking about obstruction of police and all these other things. That's what I worry about if the SRO program didn't exist, is you're going to have cops that handle the things the way they do on the road, as far as it is black and white, and here's what I'm doing because you called me. As opposed to the SRO that says, well, slow everything down. We've got parents that have an interest in this. We've got teachers, the staff. I know this kid. I know the social worker. I know the counselor. Let's slow this down and work together, as opposed to just exercise our authority and say, nope, we have the right to do this and we'll take them out. So I understand what you're saying. I honestly, I could be overridden. I don't see a whole lot of wiggle room on that as far as talking to a suspect. If we choose to interview that suspect and we have reason to think they committed a crime, the law is going to trump a policy and we can do just that. We don't want to do that.
The law trump my opinion on it too.
Yeah. And this is like one of those where I'm comfortable with us having like different priorities that are, I mean, my priority A may be your priority B, and your priority B might be mine A, and it may result in kind of different perspectives on this, and I'm okay with that. And I think how we kind of figure out, that's what figuring this out is. So, like, I think we just have different views on this, and I don't think you're wrong and I'm right. I'm just kind of like, this is one where I'm like, this one doesn't feel quite right. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll go back to you, Nan. I'm way past time. Yeah.
Which is, I think this is where the data actually is going to be really helpful, because in a year from now, we'll be able to look at how many times does this actually happen? We've now spent an hour plus talking about this. Did this happen once? Did it happen twice?
Yeah.
Did it happen several times, but only with a particular officer? You know what I mean? Like, I think that's what's going to help us. Right now, we're operating in this vacuum, and I think we're all thinking worst case scenario, best possible outcome for kids, and we're all wanting the same thing. But you are having to abide by the law. And we're trying to make sure that parents, who are our most important partners, don't feel like we're throwing their kids.
I want to just touch base on the parents. We talk about parents a lot, and the majority of parents are supportive. They're holding their kid accountable and that kind of thing. A lot of the kids, though, that commit crimes and are problematic for your district, they get that behavior from their parent. And that parent, when they find out that the police department's involved, we think we have trouble with the kid. Boy, we have real trouble with mom and dad. We have disruptions at your school, people wanting to fight with us, yelling and swearing. If you think you're taking my kid into custody, you're taking me too. It is very complex. So we try not to cause that storm in your school by inviting the parent in and having that happen. A lot of times the kid will text the parent anyway, and they come in and cause a huge disruption in the school. There are reasons we do things the way we do. We'd much rather have them at the police department beating and yelling and screaming at our desk than doing so in your main office. So it isn't always the supportive or the kid that's frightened of law enforcement. A lot of times we get kids that have been around the block a few times, or their parents aren't the model citizen. And suddenly they're instilling these values in their kids. And then we're dealing with that too. So rather than have that major disturbance in the school, we opted to go a different route. It isn't pretty and it doesn't feel good, but oftentimes that's what happens.
Yeah, I think Leanne's point is really well taken, and I have so many conflicted internal views on this. This is why I'm struggling through it, but I want to kind of do it publicly as well. Last thing I want to say is thank you both for the SROs. There's certainly been a lot of challenges, and I'm thinking back to all the to issues that happened several years ago at West, in partnerships around a really significant threat of violence. There's, I think, a lot of good opportunities here. So thank you for your service, and kind of thank you for kind of working through this and kind of navigating it together through us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Okay. Well, thank you again for being here. So I really appreciated you saying at the start of this that building relationships is your number one goal in this role, which I do think is probably unique from a law enforcement officer. I don't know if I'm using that terminology correctly, but that it is a unique role to be a school resource officer. And so I want to be really thoughtful about that. And I think we would be remiss not to acknowledge that there is a difficult history in our country and also in our community between the police and people of color in particular. And so I think it's really important that we kind of start at that place and then sort of move from there, recognizing that your role and our role too is to keep children safe in schools, but that means lots of things to lots of people. So you're thinking of it, I think, often from sort of a legal standpoint or a criminal standpoint, and we're thinking about it as far as, psychological safety, making sure that people feel like they're safe to come to school and they're not going to be, there's not going to be sort of a bias against them. So I want to, I guess I just want to acknowledge that that's an elephant in the room. And if we don't start from there, we're sort of not listening to what's happening in this country. So with that in mind, I have a number of different sort of concerns, questions. I mean, I'm going to obviously assume that the things that make sure that we meet our Fund 80 requirements and meet that list of 10 needs of the district, that's going to be written into an updated SRO so that becomes sort of a foundation of what is in this contract for you all. That would probably make sense, right? You're saying most of this is already happening. So this is, again, just codifying what's already happening. So the questioning of a parent presence. So I'm going to come back to this, and I know you've kind of already talked about this. And I guess what I'm stuck on, because I'm hearing what you're saying, and while I understand that our policy does not match what is actually the law, what you're saying, though, is that as an SRO, you use discretion. And it would really be your last case scenario to talk to a child without a parent being notified or present. Is that what I'm hearing?
Not necessarily, no. If there's a criminal investigation going on and we have to interview someone about a crime that has occurred or is about to occur, that is the priority, to get that information out of whether it's a juvenile or an adult. That is the priority. So we try to, in every scenario, if we can include parents or if we can include administration or anything, we always try to work towards that, but that isn't the end all. The end all for us is getting that information that is key to a crime that may be about to occur has occurred.
So the crime happened, then we have to do our investigative phase component of it. And I'm glad you brought up the elephant in the room. We do have a diverse crew of SROs. You've seen them, you've met them. And that's an important component of that interaction, that our SROs look like the community that they're out there serving as well. But I respectfully disagree. We don't look at things through black and white, especially with the SRO role. It has to be more holistic. Mm-hmm. It's not black and white. It's not just the law or they walk free, violation of law. It's how can we problem solve and have those partnerships and holistically look out for what we're trying to accomplish, keeping the kid out of the criminal justice system or the young adult, making sure that parents, we're not there to parent these kids. We're there to keep everybody safe. And we don't do it alone. We don't do it in a vacuum. It has to have school involvement. It has to have parental involvement, but it also has to be at the appropriate time. Mm-hmm. If we're in the investigation phase and information gathering phase, we have to determine if a crime has occurred or not. So we can make that problem solving judgment. We can figure those things out. What are our next steps going to be? Sometimes it'll involve handcuffs and taking a young person into custody. Other times it'll be using our discretion and having the parents be involved or having the school administrator have some type of administrative sanction.
Yeah, and I appreciate that there's sort of all these shades of gray about how you do your job. I think though the struggle is the way that the MOU is written currently, which is not shades of gray. You know, for example, it says parental contact of a suspect shall not be made until a law enforcement interview on campus is complete. So I would love to see us softening the language to match what you're telling us here today, so that we will use our discretion. Or I think there was something you said.
I think the reason I put that stronger language in there is because we have times where we're in the middle of an interview.
I can take this one, Jim.
Absolutely.
Where a school administrator, then we don't fall on my shoulder, sorry. Where a school administrator will come in and say, don't say anything. Well, wait a minute here. You're now interfering with a police investigation. That's, like Mr. Meyer said, that's not your job. We're there to protect the rights of the individual that we're interviewing. But we also have to determine if a crime has been committed as well. Other times we don't want to have parents showing up at school. You can call that. I mean, you have your rules of engagement when it comes to parental notification. You're obligatory reporters as well. I would caution it's a delicate subject, or it's a fine balance, I should say, where you don't want to have the parents showing up at school and next thing you know, you have problems then peripherally in your school that can lead to other things.
Yeah. No, and I hear what you're saying. I think that's sort of the rub is like, if you, and I'm not suggesting we don't have SROs, but I'm going to give this as an example. So I just don't want anybody to jump on me later to say that I'm saying this. But if we didn't have an SRO program in our school, school administrators would decide that we want, this rises to the level of a criminal concern. We need to call the police come in, and then we know what you're going to do. We know that you're there. In the SRO role, though, you're walking around the schools. So you're in our buildings. We're funding the program, but you're saying basically we don't have any authority to make some of those decisions about the administration saying we want to do this or we don't want to do this. I really struggle with that because, again, we do have different roles. You know,
the administrator in the building, the principal of the building has complete control of his or her building. It is their building. We are there just to supplement and help them in any way we can. But if something rises to the level of a crime, we have now risen above the control of that administrator. It is now a criminal matter to where the police are involved and then are in charge. So it's a hard pill to swallow. You're right. We are there. You know, we service Mayfair Mall. We're officers in there. We have facilities there where they're constantly to support them. But we don't ask the manager necessarily if someone's got a gun and they're walking around the mall, like, are you okay if we do this? Or do you want to contact somebody? You know, I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying to say, as an example, we have a responsibility as law enforcement to take charge in those situations. So you're right. In that circumstance, law would then be above the administrator in the building.
There's some context to that, if you don't mind, Dr. Hoy. We're there to stabilize the scene and then investigate in that order. And it's something that is codified in our policies and our rules and procedures. The law tells us we have to investigate any crime that comes to our attention. The outcome piece of it, I think, is where people have concern with in that process. Again, having that relationship with the school administrators, with the SROs, I would expect them to notify the SRO, have that discussion, but hey, we got to take it to this place over here. This is now a serious crime and you can't be in the room. We have to interview this person. We have to protect their rights. We have to protect you as a school administrator so you don't interfere in this as well.
This is the thing I'm thinking was actually two examples that you brought up earlier, the THC and the bad choice of sex in the hallway there's these two things where you have to behave in certain ways, even if you're looking for creative ways to alternatively respond to it. Like certain things, your hands are tied. And so those are kind of examples of spaces where you have to follow the law. You have to follow certain processes. And whereas the district might say, we're going to deal with this through an administrative process that still is going to have some teeth and consequence, but may look different than in the THC piece, a felony.
That would make me very happy if we could find a middle ground that goes to an administrative sanction versus a civil ordinance violation citation or a criminal sanction.
Yeah.
The officers don't want to do the reports and see, a young person and in the criminal justice system when I'm telling you, we're trying to keep them out of it.
And this is the mind of myself as a conduct officer on a college campus through much of my career of what are the different tools and resources you have to get to the same desired outcome. And that's one of the things that maybe as we look at the MOU too, to figure out, maybe it belongs in the MOU, maybe it's in policy, something else, of how do we make sure that we're utilizing all of our tools, not tying our hands, handling. I've always had the philosophy of handle the things at the lowest level possible. Sometimes the lowest level possible is a really high level and you jump right to that. But for some of this stuff, I'm thinking about how do we make sure that we're keeping kids on the right track and figuring this out? I don't have the answers here, but that's one where I think you all, as I was listening to you talk, that's the thing I'm figuring out. Knowing you're bound in ways that the district may have different flexibility.
I think the better we do our job, wearing our hat, to keep kids from getting to the resource officers. And we know we need to do a better job with our deans of students, with our social workers, with our psychologists. I think if we're doing our job, wearing our hat, well, it's a different MOU need than if we're not doing our school district administration job well. And we do know in the past, we did lean too much on the SROs. And from a board level, we saw that and we didn't like it. And And, you know, and now there's things we need to have behavioral interventions earlier, and we'll have less things go to the. So this whole, it's all like an ecosystem of people wearing their hats. And part of our solution to our concern with the police wearing their hat is look to ourselves to wear our hat better.
It's also mutual respect for each other's role. I cited the example of having a school administrator come in during the middle of a interview. Well, please respect our role. We're here to do our policing thing, but that respect has to be mutual the other direction too, that you're trying to manage and take care of the educational needs of this particular school, the staff, the students, administrative function, all those things.
We already talked about soft uniforms. I'm in agreement. I don't remember who said that, but I'm in agreement. I think it's okay to have it written that there's some flexibility in that, but I would love the soft uniforms to be the rule, not the exception.
I think the SROs basically, they like the soft uniform. So I don't think you're
Probably.
gonna
It's
get-
probably much more comfortable.
It's more comfortable. There is a question though, like oftentimes, like we are trained, we have muscle memory for where our tools are. And if you wear the soft uniform, suddenly you're like, oh, where'd I put that? So there's that. One of the things with the soft uniform that we agree with it for many reasons, and at times we don't. But the number one thing, we have a defense and arrest tactics is something that we're trained on. It's state mandated. But the very first piece of information in there is what is our first use of force, if you will. It is merely our presence in uniform, right? So if you're dealing with a kid at the school and they know who you are, and they may not need that presence there. But if you have the bad guy that comes in off the street who suddenly wants to cause a problem for the school, they're like, who's this guy in this Longfellow shirt?
It's
right?
a de-escalating effect too, just by your
Right.
presence being.
But you're saying also that your primary goal in that role is to build relationships. So I think what you wear on a daily basis should reflect that.
I think safety is also a very close second to that, right? So we have to make sure that we're safe. So the other thing is, let's say a worst case scenario, there's an active shooter in the building and cops are coming from all over the place. We got them from every jurisdiction you can imagine. And there's someone running through the school with a Whitman polo on with a gun in their hand. The officers responding like, I don't know who that is, but that looks dangerous. And then we've had cops getting shot by other cops because they're not even recognizable. We have an instance where, let's say you're at Longfellow and the bank's getting robbed across the street, and the SRO by proximity is the first one there because that's happening right there. They step across the street and they're not in this uniform. That creates big problems for us. So I said this before, and I think we talked about it last time we were here. It's sort of talking out both sides of my mouth. I'm advocating for the uniform and telling you why it's so important. At the same time, understanding why the soft uniform is important, but trying to leave that discretion to the SRO because they know in their minds how they feel safe and what they feel is required to do their job safely and to keep everybody else safe. If they're comfortable with the soft uniform, then so be it. But if they're adamant that they want the uniform, and part of our interview process, by the way, is to ask them that question because we want them to say, no, I like the soft uniform. So we understand it, we like it. One more piece about the soft uniform. We are trying to build those relationships as we discussed, and we want to be seen as human beings in the schools. And the uniform is a barrier to that. We know that. But we also want them to get familiar with the uniform because we want them to be out on the street like, no, these cops aren't all bad. My SRO was great, and associate the uniform with the patrol officer on the street. So there's that aspect of it too. It's really kind of complex, but we are completely open to letting the SROs do that. Just didn't really want to put language in there to say they shall do this or they shall do not.
And I can't do that because of operational necessity too. There's sometimes that my decision-making process, no, I need people in blue uniforms out there. Or there's an SRO who's working a shift because of our staffing. They've got to go immediately and cover a patrol shift as well. But again, I'm not going to lay the law down and say, no, you got to be in this uniform all the time. The SROs know when it's appropriate. We all recognize that this is a barrier to effective relationship building. And one thing, Dr. Hoyg, I want to correct you, safety is my first concern. Always. If people are upset with decisions I make or what the officers make, our safety or everybody's safety is my primary concern. The relationship building is part of increasing that safety capacity. So
I definitely agree with that. So two things that I think we sort of skated by, and I have my notes here, but as far as the interview and the interviews with the school district involved in our interview process. We did do that recently. We have talking about the rotation and people retiring. SROs that are in place and ready to go to work in the schools. And we had Laura Geisler on board for that, your school safety coordinator. So it was great to have her there and give some opinions and see the people that were running up there. Ultimately, that discretion ends with the chief as far as who's going to be hired, but we are open to the input and we like the idea. We're working as partners with you and serving your schools. We want you guys to have at least a voice in that. So that's something that's important. The elephant in the room that was spoken of earlier, and I agree with you, when there's the history of this country and law enforcement, particularly with people of color, it is there, it exists, and we all know it. I think we've gotten far, far better. I know our police department does not want any racist in the building because that's just bad for everybody, right? What's interesting though about the uniform is, and I'm an old white guy. Okay, but I wear this uniform and I have been called a racist more times than I can count before I can even put my car in park. So people discriminate against us for the job that we do. So I'm familiar with discrimination, certainly not to the degree that minorities maybe, but we know what it's like. And I think that's actually, it's like we go through training and we carry a taser. I have to be tased to know what that feels like. Well, I have some knowledge of what it feels like to be discriminated against, and we fight against that. I always say it, I said it in the high schools for years, I wish we get rid of race altogether and just call it the human race. That would be far better with me because that's what we all are. We're all brothers and sisters. And so we try not to look through the lens of race. I bring it up because you brought it up, and I think it's important. But I can tell you, working in this police department, I've been with TOSA for 14 years. I worked for MPD for 2 before that. That is something that the department is against. We have a very diverse department, and we want to get over that hurdle like everybody else. And what I think hurts the most as a cop is 2019, like right before COVID struck, everyone was coming. Thank you for working, officers. You guys are working. We were working 12-hour shifts while everyone else was sheltering at home. We were trying to be out there. And people were bringing us cookies and putting signs, thanks for your help. And then George Floyd hit. And suddenly those same people were all attacking us and you're a racist and you're a problem and you're this and you're that. And we hadn't changed anything we were doing. So going through those experiences, that's life experiences. Those are tough experiences, but we bring that knowledge to schools too, and we aren't there to discriminate.
Also the humanistic piece. We want people to see us as human beings. I've said that from day one as being the new chief, not so new anymore. I want people to identify with us as human beings behind this uniform.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that relationship piece is so important. And then having the empathy piece, again, talking about the elephant in the room.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And you're right. Like I can appreciate that the police have had, some difficulties, sort of the few bad apples kind of mentality. But I also want to be really thoughtful that like this is 400, we're here like at 400 years of real racism, like sort of thread into into our institutions, including how we enforce laws. So I think it's very aspirational to say someday we'll all be the human race, totally want that as well, but we're not there. And so I think we have to recognize that there's implicit bias and we have to sort of acknowledge it if we want to not continue to perpetuate it. So
We'll never get there with that.
Okay, so I mean, that's fine.
Can I just add, Dr. Hoyt, some people are still fearful, and how
Lots of people are still
work-
fearful.
I just want to piggyback on what you
Yeah,
said.
no, I appreciate that.
And how can you help that?
How could we help with people's fear of police?
By being human, by being connected, by having these open conversations that talk about these critical issues, and I guess dispelling the bias piece of it. When people say
Action.
over nationally police it, well, I can tell you from my very short year, went pretty fast, that's not the Wauwatosa Police Department. I've never seen a more caring and empathetic group of cops that really care about this community. I'm proud to lead this department because I've got a stake in this. And I've shared that all with you in private in my correspondence. So how do we get past that? by having these types of critical conversations, by developing those type of relationships with staff, making sure a policy aligns with what the law says, and figuring those things out. We're not going to figure it out overnight, but we're making progress. That's steps in the right direction.
I think the SRO program too in and of itself. I mean, I've spoken countless classes, was invited to speak in classes, usually do an hour presentation on any given topic. And it's the give and take with the students on those. That's where we earn a lot of respect from students or show them a different side. So that's helping with that. Some of the best relationships I've had with students at school, and I kind of was hard on myself because I'm not Officer Burbach. She is officer friendly. She is like, everybody loves her, right?
Officer Tracy.
So I am not that person. I'm friendly enough, but I'm not bubbly Tracy Burbach. But one of the administrators at the school told me I wasn't the best at that with all the kids, but what I was the best at was the troubled kids, the kids that had problems, the kids that were in trouble in school, getting arrested, that kind of. Those are the kids I had the relationships with. They came to see me before they would talk to an administrator or talk to their teacher. So those types of bonds that we built, if I show the kids respect, decency. If I took them into custody, they were generally surprised by the time they left. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for me after arrest somebody to take them to McDonald's and sit and have lunch with them afterwards before bringing them home or bringing them to school. I'm talking about on the street as an adult late shift. I'm talking about the students in the school. So those types of things help.
But some believe they've been wronged. They believe they've been wronged. And how, and if there are complaints like that, how do we mitigate those?
By being transparent. I've said this time and time again, police work is not pretty. There's a lot of ugliness to it when we have to use force, deadly force sometimes lower levels of force that you see in a YouTube video of us having to take somebody to the ground or wrestle and fight with them, but then explaining why that had to happen. We don't want to do that. I can tell you last school year, 3 SROs had to take a young lady into custody and they were beating themselves up around the station because they felt like they had failed that young lady. They felt like they failed. And I said, no, you did what you had to do. And the parents were not called until afterwards. I said, no, we are not showing them the body worn camera. We have an obligation to show them that conduct of their child and have that critical conversation. That's how you build trust, not to cast blame, but hey, so they understand why we had to take their daughter to the ground and wrestle with her to get her into handcuffs. You know what? We did our job. We wrote the citation. We stabilized the scene. We investigated. Here's your child back intact, but we need to be talking about that to keep them out of the criminal justice system. That's how we build trust on our end. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think we need to keep things in context to understand what it is you're speaking of. We're very quick in this country, and I'm guilty of it too, the knee-jerk reactions to say, oh, I got an excerpt this big from the news. This must be fact. Get the facts first, right? People are jumping to conclusions immediately about what police are doing.
I mean, if you get a phone call from an administrator, I want that conversation to happen. What really happened from our perspective, why that person had to be taken into custody versus having people fill in the blank with their own whatever.
I've sat with irate parents and brought them in and let them watch video, show them what has happened, explain to them what has happened. So we do our best to talk with people and explain circumstances. We can't fix hundreds of years of, mistrust, thousands for that matter, but within law enforcement. But little by little, our interactions with people, hopefully even like a meeting like this today, you're getting a piece of what our perspective is and what we're trying to do. I mean, some people probably don't trust what we're saying right now, but all we can do is continue acting, and hopefully you can tell from our actions that we're not really out to get anybody, and certainly aren't biased in doing so.
I just have a couple. I'm going to list my things real, because otherwise I feel like you're going to tell me if my time's up.
You can list them and then we'll go.
Okay. So tracking the data, I think that's really important. I'd love to see us re-examine what data we're tracking, and think about how often the board is going to get updated on that data.
It's on your internal server, though. You can see that through Dr. Means at any time, I would assume.
Well, it's probably maybe more of a Dr. Means put it on his plate, but yes.
We're asking for lots of data on lots of things.
I would like, again, this is more of an administration thing, but I'd love to see us identify when our SROs should be getting engaged with our students and when it should be more of our mental health. I forget
Student services.
Student services, yeah, when that should be the team that's intervening. Would really also like to think about the grievance stuff. I think right now it's written that the school administration doesn't have much of a role or any role in identifying or learning about the investigation or being part of the investigation if there is a grievance against an SRO. But I really feel like that's a really important part of that collaboration and partnership, is that if there is a concern or a complaint, that should be something that we're doing together.
In my 7 years as an SRO, there hadn't been a grievance against an SRO, at least not one that was brought to our attention. We had one last year that turned out to be unfounded. And it was investigated, I think, certainly by the school and the police department. But where we ran into trouble was the school basically wanted to investigate and speak to our employee without even notifying our department or its supervisors. So as an example, if you had a cleaning crew here and it was hired by an outside agency, yet you noticed something the cleaning crew did that was inappropriate, I think it'd be out of line for you to then interview that person and do an investigation of that person. That I think that falls more on their employer. You can certainly contact the employer and say, here's what we've observed, here's what we think's happening, and be kept apprised as to what their investigation is. Or maybe they're agreeable to having you there, as part of the questioning. But that's where we ran into the problem. It's been one in at least, I've been out of it for 2 years. So 1 in 9 years that I'm aware of, and it turned out to be unfounded. And so, yes, we would prefer to investigate our own on that, just like I'm sure you would want to investigate your own administrator or something. We don't go talking to a school personnel for a violation that they may have done or a rule they may have violated by a school rule. That would be something we would turn over all day long. We have instances where I know as an SRO, we had, people that furnished the food to the students and whatnot with maybe some minor thefts or that kind of thing. And the school district would ask us to then look into that. But if it was a personnel matter, then we turn that right back over to human resources and say, that's all yours. So a human resource perspective, if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, except in this case, you're in our house, sort of, you know what I mean? So I think it's different than saying, if I came to the police department and I don't know, I did something, I think it's different. It's not as clear cut. And what I'm suggesting, I guess, is a partnership, not you take full control or the school district takes full control, but really having a partnership in how those grievances are addressed. And hopefully, to your point, it will almost never happen.
Well, we do have a very good internal investigation process. Complaints can be filed, or a grievance, as you put it, it can go through the Police and Fire Commission. It can go to the department directly, and that gets assigned to a supervisor to look to see if there's merit to it. And then it's a full internal investigation where we protect the rights of the employee, we protect the rights of the organization. There's an interview process, there's an investigative process. And ultimately, that discipline falls on my desk, whether or not to pull the SRO out, for example, or have some type of policy or rule violation. And if there is, that decision falls on me to decide if it's going to be either a termination or a suspension, pulling that SRO out and having them be replaced. So we do have a very good complaint procedure, if you want to call it that, or a grievance process. And we have it out on our website too, and if you wanted to take a look at it. I can't have somebody from the school board sitting on an internal rules policy violation. That wouldn't happen.
I think for me, it's that that's going 0 to 60 versus that's formal complaint. I don't want to interpret, but I think it's just how do we make sure that we're having good conversations and feedback is happening, and a student raises something and it doesn't rise to the level of complaint or grievance, but that we're noticing a trend, or I think there's this line that we have to find where it's like we're in true partnership because we both want the same thing, right? And so it's how do we make sure that both sides are really open to the feedback of like how do we make this relationship work when we're both in positions of authority, but very different positions of authority and have very different responsibilities in terms of so I think I totally appreciate that there's an internal complaint process and whatnot, but like, how do we make sure that like, it doesn't even have to get to that level, but if something comes up, we also don't feel like it's jumping immediately to that where.
That's where we have our sergeant, our supervision team. If something comes to my attention, then it must be pretty serious.
Yep.
That's where I don't micromanage the sergeant or the lieutenant or the captain. There's a lot of layers of oversight in the administration bureau, which the SROs fall under. But if those things can be mitigated at the lowest level, like you said, I would prefer that. If it doesn't rise to a grievance or an official internal investigation. We're all about quality control of our service that we provide to the community. It has to be a back and forth. Sometimes those complaints have merit, sometimes they don't. Sometimes people are upset that the police had to use force, or they don't like the fact that they got a citation. Well, that's what we had to do, and this is what the law and our policy says. You may not like it, but that's where we have somebody like Sergeant Morrill will give that information. I'm also looking for the development of my SROs as well. If somebody isn't cutting the mustard, they're not doing their job, there's employee improvement plan. That's that back and forth where you have your expectations, I have my expectations, figure where we have that common ground.
So hearing the concerns, I'd remind everyone that you said yourself that SROs are not patrol officers. That the reason to have an SRO is that these various incidents that have happened are not involving SROs with traffic stops and things that we addressed your concerns because we have SROs that if a police intervention is needed, we're much more likely to have, this very specialized, highly trained, talented person that's not your typical, nothing against traffic officers, but just to say it's a special job you have and you have special people doing it. And that to me answers some of these concerns, societal concerns that are being expressed.
The good news is that a lot of times we think of law enforcement as the Joe Friday, who, what, where, when, how. We forget the why. And one of the things that's given me a lot of comfort, I've seen officers in action out on the street where they'll take that extra couple of seconds to say, here's the why of it. People want to know, why did I get stopped? Why am I getting issued a citation? And I'm happy to say that even on the patrol force, patrol side of things, those officers do take that time. They are caring. They are.
I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anybody. I love you all, but now concerns are being voiced, and it's saying, well, we've addressed it by having. It seems counterintuitive, but by having SROs, we are actually addressing the concerns with an extra level of training and capability for the officers who are in our buildings. They are special, the SROs. To us, you're special. Not the traffic cops or anything wrong with them, but SROs for us, you all are really special. And so thank you.
They have institutional knowledge too that needs to be passed on in mentorship to others. That is going back to that, why do we want to cycle SROs through? So we can pass on that institutional knowledge to that next generation of SROs. We want to make it so it's not just an arbitrary every 2 years, boom, 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 boom. It has to somehow coincide with the life cycle of a student going through the school system. Where before it was a place you went to and were an SRO until somebody pulled you out. There has to be some logical mentorship and progression so people can share that knowledge back out on the patrol force. They've also done a good job of mentoring somebody to take their place. Because people will leave, they'll resign, they'll retire.
If I can just make a comment about Dr. Hoyt's comment. I think, we have a duty and a responsibility to protect our students. And I think that's where that piece comes in. For a process for a student to file a complaint that's outside of what the district offers. I'm in no way suggesting or implying that this is the the Wauwatosa Police Department, but there have been historical accounts of SROs taking advantage of their position. The district I came from, an SRO was having sexual encounters with students in the building. The reality is it happened. So there needs to be a process where if a student does not feel like an SRO is acting appropriately for whatever reason, or a parent, that there is an avenue in which they can launch a formal or even informal complaint, but there needs to be a process that the district is a part of.
There absolutely is, and they should do that. They can voice that opinion to an administrator, a teacher, a parent, a fellow student.
But I think there's no process according to the MOU where, the district has its own authority to investigate that complaint. Is that correct?
I want to think about that because I don't, and Chief, correct me if I'm wrong. If a student came forward to an administrator and said the SRO did something inappropriate, I would have zero problem with it unless you talked about sex with a student, that would be a major criminal matter. But maybe on a smaller level, whatever. I don't have a problem with an administrator asking questions of other students, maybe gathering some information for us to say, hey, this complaint came forward. I talked to a couple of people. And this sounds like it's an issue. It's a criminal matter. It's a police matter yet again. Now we don't major crimes like a homicide or police involved shooting. We don't even investigate ourselves, right? And I know there's a conflict of interest there. If you're talking about someone that risen to that level, I don't know where.
And I'm not. I mean, not things that egregious, but that's why I think that there needs to be a process in place and something in the MOU that dictates what is that process between the district and the police department.
If there is that codified in the MOU, that would be for any type of administrative sanction, because like I said, our policy, rules, procedures, and the law say that it falls under our purview. But if there's some type of administrative sanction, it wouldn't have any teeth towards the officer other than somebody bringing it to our attention, and then it falls on our purview to investigate what's going on. But then there has to be the communication back and forth. Well, if a student said that an SRO said something inappropriate, okay, we looked into it. The SRO was, I don't know, there could be several dispositions on that there was employee retraining, there was some type of mediation between the student and the SRO, or if it's something that egregious of a SRO doing something like you described, that'd be an easy decision.
Sure.
We have a number of different relationships with other vendors. Sodexo provides our food service. Dan Plotz provides our contracted cleaning. And under those scenarios, if an employee is accused of doing something that we have to investigate, typically we would jointly do it with the supervisor of that service that's provided to us. We wouldn't be excluded from it. We would be kept updated because as part of the MOU is just not identifying the relationship, there is an exchange of funds from the school district to the police department, just like there's an exchange of funds between the school district and Dan Plotz or Sodexo in the school district. So I think there are ways. I don't think it's a either or. I think it's a yes and. I think there we have found ways to do this in a collaborative fashion with other agencies that are providing a service to the school district.
And the one thing, I would just point out is that like from a human resources perspective, whomever has been accused also has the right to privacy so long as it has not risen to a certain level in terms of if the retraining is happening or if that person is receiving some additional coaching or whatever. I think that's one of the hardest things that I deal with on a regular basis is somebody raises an issue, and they want to know exactly what's being done to that person to fix X. And legally, you cannot share that. And sometimes it feels very unfulfilling to say to the person, we're handling it, and
it stinks to say that.
Right. Well, but there has to be trust. And so I keep thinking about how we change perception in the community is that kids, families start having different experiences, or we have the data to say like these experiences, these situations, we agree were warranted or et cetera. So I think this is all moving us in that direction. But to Ms. Willis's point, Dr. Hoyt's point, like we just want to make sure that we're capturing in here foundational things to set us up for success in this first year. And I fully expect that we will come back as a board, and look at where we need to be more explicit or where we can loosen the reins a little bit.
I just wanted to underscore, we have experiences and protocols where we are receiving services from external vendors, how we do this collectively. And there is a demarcation line where the vendor will say, we thank you for your input. We'll take it from here. But I think there's also points in that journey where we're doing it in a collaborative fashion. So I think there's some models, and
Yep.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a yes and I think we can get there because we're doing it with other vendors right now.
Dr. Hoig, wrap up your session in 40 minutes. Mr. Phillips?
Sure. One point on the Fund 80 before I just put a pin in it. What's the definition of direct employer? Is it the funder or is it the span of control?
It's the control.
Span of control. It's like, if we're going to get audited on this and not ultimately sign on that. I just want to make sure that we understand that.
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then, like, I love the talk about partnership and some of the reactive stuff that we've been talking about. Like proactively, I know you mentioned about, having somebody from the district help out with interviewing, but like, what about training? And what about informal reviews? Or we just did a 360 survey, feedback on Dr. Means as part of that evaluation. How do you see that partnership working, in a perfect world? I know you've done research on it. So how do you see that? You have a new officer. How do we help participate in the onboarding of the school? How do we help them with junior high versus high school? Like how does that partnership work in a proactive way?
Well, I'm going to use the example of Officer Burbach.
Yeah.
She's stated that she intends on leaving sometime next year.
Yep.
So we had the internal hiring process of which the school system was involved in. And part of that interview process, file review, those kinds of things. And the appointment was made for actually 2 SROs. We're also planning for the next step.
Yeah.
Having one in reserve, or if we have a 4th position somewhere down the road, if our staffing allows for it.
Chief, before you move on, because that's been a community issue or question. The district has not backed away from 4 SROs. Can you explain why we're down to 3 right now?
Yeah, we had 4 and we made the ask. We said, hey, this is the unfunded position, but out of necessity, we need to pull this person back to the department because we still are struggling with staffing. So that was a PD decision. I'd like to go back to 4. I'd like to see our staffing be what it was a year ago. Part of the onboarding is working directly with that SRO that's sunsetting out, if you want to call it that, to establish those relations, make introductions, start to get a feel for what does that role look like. It's OJT, making sure they go to the formalized training as well before they are fully in that role. So they have a partner, they have a field training officer, just like we do for onboarding new employees. Until that SRO attends the training, they are squared away. They have those relationships. They know what that function is. And then we see where they're going to take it while they're being monitored by Sergeant Morrill for specific key performance indicators, which that's part of that codification in the MOU, that they're documenting their contacts, that they are developing those relationships. They are doing I always hated to see on an officer's assignment sheet for the day, their log of what they do, unobligated time. I can tell you the SROs they have little to no unobligated time, but let's put it somewhere. That for 20 minutes, I was in the commons of Tosa West and I talked to 5 students about upcoming homecoming or, hey, the football, write it down, put it down that's what I was doing in that unobligated time. That also shows the sergeant that they're doing all different facets of that policing mission, not just the law enforcement department, trust building, relationship building, supporting school staff, developing relationships with students. Those kinds of things. So hopefully that explains how that process works.
Yeah, a little bit. I was like, I have a recent middle schooler and a very, very current high schooler, and they're very different people, right? So how can we help in some of that differentiated training. I know the MOU program or the the officer program is seems to be, it says basic, right? So how do you, like, how can we help, or what does that relationship look like where we help you really get granular around that age appropriate stuff and middle school versus high school? Like, what does that look like? How does that feel? Yeah.
I guess before I answer that, I want to talk about the something I think would be very, very good to gauge the performance of the SRO, because oftentimes, I mean, I'm not even overseeing them that much. I'm not physically there in the rooms with them. The people that are the administrators, the staff, obviously students. I would love to see an annual or biannual review done by an administrator to say, here's how we think our SRO is doing. Here's the weak points, great points, whatever. So that we can assess that. So it isn't just bias on our part, or this assuming that everything's going wonderfully. Because there are times where it hasn't. We've talked to administrators where it's not working out too great. What can we do to fix it?
And sometimes a year's too long.
It is, right? So then you do it by, I think, maybe twice a year, whatever. Also survey the staff and students and families. See what their perspective has been. Granted, you're going to get some people that may have gotten a ticket and now they hate them too. So I don't know. But I think if you look at the large number of responses you would get, you would probably get a pretty good feel for what that was. You bring up some interesting ideas as far as how do you place an SRO, whether it be an elementary,
place and prepare.
How do you do that, right? I would definitely be open to input from the district on that, as far as how they thought. Maybe if we inserted someone somewhere and they're like, boy, we think they're better suited for here. Usually the SROs will talk amongst themselves and say, you know what, you're probably more suited for middle school or whatnot. But we do that through the interview process, through knowing the officers who've worked for us for years, and then we kind of get to know their personality, where their fit might be. We've already done it, with the next two SROs sort of waiting in the wings where we think they'd be best suited. And that's through conversations with them or observations of them, seeing how they work with who. I think I was far better suited for the high school than I would have been for the younger kids. And that was my own personal assessment. So I would be open to input from the schools. If you guys have stuff you'd like to have us consider for that, but honestly, I don't know of a great way to do it other than us sort of knowing who that employee is and getting feedback from them.
May I ask a different, Mr. Phillips, it's always thoughtful. I have a different question, which is, during the course of this conversation, there have been a lot of people give me articles here or there around what they consider to be best practice for school resource officers. And, the unfortunate shooting in Texas a few months ago indicated where maybe police response was not ideal. My question is, and I'm not asking you to name the departments and the relationships, but are you aware of best practices in terms of relationships between a police department and a school system? Do school resource officers get together and network and talk? Just out of curiosity, is there some type of networking that the similar position of Ms. Chrysler and your position that oversees the school resource officers, is there some type of networking where that happens? Or are you looking at certain departments that you would say that's what we're aspiring to? I think as I was listening to your question, that's another element to this.
Well, Uvalde was something that I personally reserve judgment for, to see, like, because we're quick to condemn officers for their work, and the media is quick to do it. At the same time, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's always wise to sit and gather the information. Now, there is an extensive study on that school shooting. There were failures in the police department. I'll say that publicly. They'll say that. There were failures on the school as well. There was all kinds of things that went wrong with that. There's people that say there was cowardice. There was all these things going on. There was scenarios where officers on one end of the hall and officers on the other. There's crossfire situation. All kinds of things that went wrong in that situation that made things go from bad to worse. There's lessons learned in that every single time, very hard and terrible lessons. I did a large presentation on this, part of what I did at St. Jude to describe school safety and on and on. So I could talk about that. I agree with you on that. I will say this, and I want you guys to know this, our police, and I'm getting off track a bit, but it's important, and it's safety. Our police officers me, the chief, anybody, if we're the first responder, the lone responder to an active shooter or something going violently wrong in a school or any other place of business for that matter, we will go in. That is our training. That is what we do. We've proven it time and again. We had the Azana Spa. We had the Mayfair Mall, and most recently at the Radisson, where 3 of our officers were shot. We go in and we address the threat. So I want you guys to be comfortable knowing that. That's what we train for. It's what we do. And we love to have at least more than one person going, but if we're the only one there, we're going. So there's that piece of it.
The network piece. I can tell you that
aspirationally, yeah.
I can tell you
Yeah.
when I worked in Milwaukee, there was Office of Community Outreach and Education.
Yeah.
And they were SROs as well that stopped. But I know there was a network that, I encouraged our SROs, hey, talk to the people over in Oco, know the SROs that work over in Brookfield, know the ones that work in West Dallas, so you can find the best ways of doing business. It may not be applicable all the time.
Right.
I know there's conferences they can go to. There's also training events that they go to, and they develop those relationships. It's no different than if Jim or I go to one of those professional conferences. That's where you go to training, but then you talk about things afterwards when you're socializing. About, hey, here's this idea, or hey, this is what we explored that's really working well.
Well, I've even like what you were mentioning, some of that cross pollination. There's a lot that I think our folks can learn from you. And then, vice versa, right? And so, to help understand education and help them understand where you're coming from, I just like those formal touch points, those opportunities for proactive collaboration so that things don't get lost in the wash. And we're not doing reactive things, right? So just to encourage you to think, you said it before, you're creative, you think outside the box, and look and embrace those opportunities to do that. Because I think there's a lot we can learn from each other and we're better together. So, yeah.
I think take one more thing here.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the things I mentioned months ago is I'm all about doing some type of feedback loop.
Yeah.
And getting feedback from parents, getting it from school administrators, from the teachers. I think it's important that we get that feedback where people might think, oh, we're doing great, wonderfully. Well,
right.
Maybe there's some things we need to tweak.
Absolutely.
Well, I think one major takeaway I will remember from this evening, we have something called a Cooperative Education Service Agency, or CESA. And our CESA typically, they do a really good job in bringing together like positions across all school systems, be it all the people who do Mr. Pena's job to the people who do my job to, candidly, the people who do the job of school board members. My wondering, and I will follow up with CESA, one of you all met Sue Doyle, who's now the executive director. And I think Ms. Moonfeld, you're our representative. You're on the board of control there. My wondering is there any way where we can at least get all the Sergeant Morals of SROs across our metro area to come together once or twice a year to talk about best practices? It would be, I think it makes all of our schools safer if you're able to talk to the SROs in Oak Creek versus the ones in Franklin versus the ones in Whitefish Bay. It makes all of our schools across the metro area better.
A network that exists with the Southeastern Wisconsin SROs. It's informal. It's basically it's a list of emails and contact information. Every year it's updated. There's someone that does it. I think they're in Greenfield, that is really good about finding out who's new, what's changed, and everything else. And then amongst that group, there's an email chain that is exchanged often with someone saying, hey, we're doing this for our school. What are you guys doing over there? So there is some of that networking going on. One time we hosted, it's been a few years now, we actually hosted an event, much like you're speaking of, where we had everybody come that was able to come. And I think it turned out to be about 15 people, but it was a group setting like this where we could actually speak and have conversations and learn. I think they're great ideas. I like where you're going with that as far as having like maybe the supervisors of it and best practices. It's something that you hit on earlier, and I think is a really good idea. Laura and I, we definitely meet once a month. We try to meet more than that if it's necessary, always in communication with each other. But I have not spoken with other school safety coordinators. And I think that's a great idea to maybe Laura and I can sort of look into that and other people that have my role as well. I love that idea. I would be all for it.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That's fine.
All right, it's interesting you bring up best practices because document I have put up in front of me are best practices for school resource officers. And it was created with the Wisconsin Department of Justice and the Wisconsin DPI. And I think that's an important collaboration and important to consider because it really, I think, really looks at the roles in educational facility, right? We're not just talking about policing out on the streets, but we're talking about police officers in our building. So I'm gonna get back to that because I want to talk about some of the things that I wrote down, but I think that this is an important place to start. And I think with the history of our district and the police department never having an MOU, I'm gonna suggest probably something unpopular, but I want to talk about some of the points just about the SRO program. So I think probably my number one concern and something we kind of touched on is criminalizing student behavior. And I think you gave actually good examples of how that happens. So let's say we did not have an SRO program in our school. And I was a high school educator last year, and I've seen students make not great choices, not great behaviors, including engaging in sexual conduct. When there are not SROs in the building, those behaviors don't get criminalized because there's not an obligation for the school to necessarily report those behaviors to the police department. But I think what you conveyed is that if there are police officers in the school, then you have an obligation to report that behavior through the criminal system, correct?
No, not necessarily. I got this one, Jim. Not necessarily. That's again, that officer discretion. And you're talking about the Josh Call document. It's 20 or 40 pages about best practices. DPI came through the Attorney General's office. Is that the one?
There's a brief one that's 4 pages. But
okay. I read one that was put out by Josh Call, the Attorney General, about best practices of SROs, giving all of us some guidance from a legal perspective. How do we figure out this relationship? I take the stance that we can't ignore the fact that a crime occurred, and nor would I encourage any school administrator or teacher to ignore it, but there are different ways of handling it. So as far as a blanket, it's criminalized. No, we're trying to reform behavior and not put people in the criminal justice. I said that so many times already tonight. I mean, I've taught juvenile justice before, criminology before, and dealing with young people is different than dealing with adults who engage in criminal behavior or do those kinds of things. Yeah, there's different ways of handling it. It's not a one size fits all.
And I think the discretion piece too, that not, as you talk about these officers rotating in and out of our schools, they're not going to all operate with the same discretion. I mean, they might view that as an instance that they should criminalize that behavior and send that kid through the criminal justice system. And that's where it just gives me, I guess, and the other, since you brought this up, I've heard stories that was brought to my attention by community members and staff about the incident with the young girl. And to me,
which incident is that?
The one that Chief McGillis talked about, where the 3 police officers had to take her in handcuffs down to the station.
Mm-hmm.
So to me as an educator, right, this is from my education lens, I see that as insubordinate behavior, but all of a sudden it became disorderly conduct. And I think that's that fine line that we talk about with education and police in our schools. And that's why I think this document really does a great job of kind of delineating some of those responsibilities. And I think we need to do a better job as a district, really defining what are those responsibilities. So when do we want the police to intervene? Because that's not clear to me. Like, I don't have clarity on, you talk about criminal behavior, and I think, all of us, I have 2 young kids in the district. We all think about safety, and I want my kids to be safe. I want every kid in the district to be safe, but that's not what we're talking about with some of these criminal behaviors that you've mentioned. Marijuana, for instance, as it's becoming legal around states around us, engaging in sexual activity. I'm not talking about those behaviors. I think you're talking about violent behaviors, and I think that's our call from our community, is to address those violent and safety concerns. But my concern is criminalizing behaviors that we typically see students engage in on a regular basis. And I say this as a parent of Black students because I do think that there are students of color, there are biases that play into that. I also have an aunt who was a law enforcement officer, so I understand the complexity of that relationship. But I'm also saying it from a lens of, I don't want any of our students to be criminalized for making bad choices. Right? Unfortunately, I don't know if that's happening, right? But I'm saying that it's not I don't think it's defined enough in our MOU for me to be comfortable to say that the SRO understands their role and responsibility to keep our schools safe, to keep the violence out, to keep the guns out. But I also don't want them to have that free range to criminalize bad choices that students make.
So is sex in the stairwell a regular basis thing?
No, but I think it's a bad choice, and I don't think it's a behavior that needs to be criminalized. I think it needs to be dealt with.
So let me tell you this. So there's mandatory reporting, right? That's a sexual assault that has occurred.
Can I ask everyone in the gallery to, if you're going to want to have conversations amongst yourselves, to step out and do that. But in here, conversation needs to be up here.
A sexual assault has occurred, whether it's consensual or not. And by law, a sexual assault has occurred. The school then has a mandatory reporting. They must report those things. It's not like if the nasty police weren't here, they wouldn't have arrested them. The police are going to be notified, should be notified anyway, that there's mandatory reporting for the crime that's occurred. And this idea of criminalizing student behavior, you take sexting, for example, one kid puts a picture of themselves nude, that's considered child pornography. It rises to the level of a felony. And they exchange it with so-and-so. And then so-and-so says, hey, look at this picture. And then they share that with me. It gets all centered around. We have a major crime that's just occurred for kids acting like kids.
For making poor
decisions. So what we've tried to do is we're working with our city attorney, and we've looked at ordinances and law across the country to try to decriminalize at least the first offense, because almost not every kid, but probably half the kids with cell phones now are doing inappropriate things with their phones. We don't want to make it a felony, a crime, and make them a sexual offender either. So we're trying to say, can we at least get an ordinance so we can write them a ticket and make this an ordinance violation? It's not a crime, doesn't rise to that level. So we're not out there trying to criminalize things, nor be in the schools to try to catch people and hope that we make an arrest and that kind of thing. There's a misconception, and I take a little bit of an exception with the bias. I hear about the bias all the time. Well, you must have a bias. You're a white cop. Clearly, you've got a bias against Black students. I do not. And I think the officers I work with do not. And people consistently tell us that, well, you're only doing this because they're Black. That is not the case. It is not, and I can tell you.
I don't think I was suggesting that.
Well, you said there's a bias.
There are biases that exist.
Of course there are. Do you have a preconceived bias against police officers? I'm not saying you do. I'm using this as an example.
No way, but I just want to acknowledge that there are biases that exist.
But that's not what's dictating the way we do our work.
Well, it's a complex issue because you have a law which should be colorblind, dealing with people from different demographics, different backgrounds, but they all want to be treated the same way when it comes to the distribution of the law, correct?
Sure, correct.
So SROs are more trained, they're more adept, they're chosen for a reason. And I'm not, again, like Mr. Myers said, our patrol force also they're great problem solvers, but SROs take it to a higher level of, again, trying to figure out solutions in the best interest of the student, while also holding them accountable. But the accountability piece can be an administrative sanction, it can be parental sanctions. I remember being fearful of my parents more than I was anybody in law enforcement. And my dad was a police officer. So I was always afraid of the parental
Double whammy
component of it. Yeah, it was a double whammy. But I also remember my SRO here in Wauwatosa, Officer Lofi, and I remember the conversations I had with that guy about, okay, if I ended up getting into trouble, that would be the guy I would go to. Hey, I messed up. Or, hey, can you help me out? I made a dumb decision because like you, Dr. Jessup Anger, we all have a past, and, it's part of growth and development.
And I appreciate that some students have that relationship with SROs because I've seen it in my own family. Not all students do. And I think I want to recognize that.
Well, can I just, Ms. Willis, I mean, the definition of implicit bias is that it's below the level of your conscious decision making. So it actually concerns me more that you're sort of standing your ground and saying, I don't operate with a bias. We all operate with a bias. And so, I think that really needs to be part of the training. And I think it's really important. The second piece I want to clarify is that as mandated reporters, we are mandated to report not crimes. We are mandated to report to child welfare systems. That's a very different system. So just to clarify.
Okay, if it's a sexual assault, it's a child abuse nature, and that needs to
No,
be
when there's
reported.
when there's sexually two consenting
There's no
adolescents, yes. No, you're as a mandated reporter, that's not part of what we have to do.
There's no such thing as consent between people under the age of 18.
Then you report to child welfare systems and they decide what they're going to do, which I can say they will never, ever.
Which could be
Investigate.
part of that process versus somebody entering into the criminal justice system. But still, we have our job as obligatory reporters to report it to the district attorney by arrest or otherwise.
Right, but that's the difference between criminalizing the behavior and operating through a mandated reporter lens, they're different things. I mean, I'm a mandated reporter in my line of work, so I'm very comfortable with what I have to report. And I've made many, many reports, but I don't have to report to the police unless someone's in imminent danger.
Right, you can report to Child Protective Services and now contact the police department. So
But they actually won't. In
Why is
reality, they won't.
why?
It won't, I can tell you, it never rises to that level.
Really? Because I've had many conversations with Child Protective
Two
Services. before that
consenting.
level. Yes, just like the DA's office. It's a whole nother argument. I think you're out of your league on that particular topic.
I'm going to keep us focused on this. We're not going to come to
The
agreement.
law is very specific in it, but I just did some training. Everybody in the city is going to be taking implicit bias training by our human resources division. And yeah, we all do have implicit biases, but part of it is being aware of them and having respect for one another's differing opinions. So obviously we have a difference of opinion here. I'm not here to play mitigator, but let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
My next point, if I may, just
Please.
training, and I think Mr. Phillips touched on that. I do think it's critical, especially being a K-12 educator, that the officers go through training that is tailored to our district, even if it's related to our strategic plan. I mean, there are things in our strategic plan around restorative justice, around social emotional well-being, and I think it would be extremely beneficial for the officers. I understand that you guys complete your own training around implicit bias or even restorative practices, but to do something that I think is focused on our youth and tailored to our district, I think would go a long way. And so I'll go back to what I was saying about the best practices. So what is unfortunate to me is that we have never had an MOU. And one of the first steps that the DOJ and DPI suggests is that we do a root cause analysis to identify if there's a need for SROs. And I don't know that we've done that as a district. And I say this too about the 3 officers. There's been a specific call from administrators and teachers and parents to have an SRO at Whitman, which we currently don't have. And I understand that one officer maybe splits their time between Whitman and Longfellow, but maybe it's not attentive to the needs that would warrant an SRO at Whitman. So I just encourage us to kind of maybe start at square one and do a root analysis of why do we want SROs in our district. Not every district has SROs. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I'm saying that we should start in a place that we really do a root cause analysis as to why we need it and then start to attack those issues. Because I don't think that we're doing that with our SROs right now. And unfortunately, I've seen it, firsthand. I've seen SROs in the elementary school responding to behavioral incidents, not to anything criminalizing, not by any means. As a staff member in the buildings, I've seen officers respond to maybe, and maybe that's the administrative piece where they don't understand the, distinguishing your role versus their role. Because in my eyes, there's going to be very little that warrants an SRO responding to an elementary age student. And then,
So whose role is it to do that root cause analysis on whether we need an SRO? Is it their role? Is it the school
it's the
board's role?
district. I think it's the district.
Well, you seem to be throwing it on them. If we need to do that analysis, so be it. But that's not, when we contract with them to be police officers, SROs in the building, they have their hat they wear. If we don't want that, you might be right. Maybe we don't need SROs.
And that's it. I'm operating under the assumption that we do. So it starts there. And then we need to kind of analyze, what do we need SROs for?
So, but you're saying we should do that.
I think the district should, yes.
Okay.
But there's already been a call, I think, from administrators, from district personnel. And if that's the case, then I think that we need to continue this partnership with the SROs to determine what role and capacity and where do we need them.
Well, it's already 2 weeks into the school year and we brought this up already months ago. I guess I need to know where the school board stands on this. Do you want SROs or not? I tell you my opinion, SROs are going to be in the schools. They need to be in the schools but we have to have this type of relationship and have it codified based on what's happened over the last couple of weeks, based on what's happened at the end of the school year last year. But again, let's codify this and put it into language on a piece of paper. But where are our roles on this? I've told you what our roles are here. I've tried to explain. I've been transparent. So ultimately, the decision is up to you if you want to make tweaks in the language, make those changes in the MOU, and we'll meet again. But again, we're also in a budgetary cycle. You're in a budgetary cycle. We have to get this thing codified. If we go back to the table and do a root cause analysis, it's going to delay what I think we all know in this room already, is that we need to keep SROs in the schools.
So what I think I heard is that in Ms. Willis's kind of question of work that the board may do into the future. Right. I think what our goal is it's not on the table right now whether or not to have SROs or not. That question isn't in question, and honestly has not been as a board.
But I think in what capacity?
And I think it's a question that can be considered, like as with anything. For those of you who've been watching school board meetings, we're auditing and questioning everything. So we're literally kind of like pulling the whole car apart, looking under the hood and everything, checking the tires, and kind of rebuilding. Our goal is we really are pushing. We want to be the best district in the country. We're not the best district in the country right now, and we're going. And I would say for everybody in the community who wants to keep pushing this run for school board, get involved in the schools. I would encourage you to do it. It's incredibly meaningful work and it's powerful, and no one's going to say thanks except for your probably kids and your spouse.
If I could just follow on Ms. Willis' comment.
What I want to say is we're committed to having the SRO program. I think we want to make sure that it's as effective as possible. It's as clear as possible. I think tonight we've covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate kind of the patience and the conversation. There's a lot of kind of authentic conversation, and we don't agree on everything, and that's okay. But I think we're also demonstrating ability to figure out how to navigate complex stuff with cameras on sometimes and everything else in ways that aren't comfortable for anybody. So what I hope that we take from this point forward, and then Ms. Fairley, come to you, is we've kind of uncovered a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things from the point where the MOU stopped being updated. Like there was the draft that was in place in May. We've got a few other things that I know we've got to place into it. Some things that it sounds like we were pretty broad agreement on a lot of things with the Fund 80 and some of the other stuff. Just document all that and then come back to the board. And I think sometimes the board can't help themselves in tweaking things because that's the board's nature. But I think that's the process of go back, work on all the things that it sounds like there's generally broad agreement on everything, documented, coming back to the board. And I think in the next, I don't think it's probably quick enough to do it in the next board meeting on Monday, but 3 weeks, 5 weeks, wherever that cadence is, we can have the first readout, and then that's the pace and timing I hope we can get to.
I think Ms. Willis did bring up a very interesting point. And I think the chief's response was also appropriate. And I don't want to sound like a broken record. And if I do, you can roll your eyes at me, and it is fair. But Mr. Meyer's statement of, well, whose job is it? Ultimately, when you go into policy and look at other policies across the metro area, they even changed the title of 5540 to say school resource officer policy. How you as a governing board want that language to rest, it will give everyone clear, definitive pathways. And so I think that's a discussion that the 7 board members have the authority to point us in a certain direction. I tried to emphasize this evening that there's there's some language that is in conflict with what our school resource officers are saying. That's how they operate. We're putting administrators, if that's ever the case, and in terms of investigations, for example, we are putting administrators in a tough spot because our language is very different than what I heard this evening. And so creating clarity for everyone involved is really, I think, important. So everyone's right. There's no wrong answer that's been stated here. I think Ms. Willis's question was, I would interpret it differently. What does this board want 5540 to say? And I think the chief is absolutely right in saying, so that's not my issue. that's your issue. But please keep in mind, we have laws we have to follow. So to your point, Dr. Jessup Anger, I think very robust conversation that I think will continue into the future. But I think the most imminent issue in front of us right now is to finalize at least this version of the MOU for school resource officers.
So what I was just going to say is that I don't want us to close making you feel like a villain or anything like that. I think you're asking really important questions. And I think not asking those questions actually leaves us in a place where we don't come up with the best policy, where we don't come up with the best practices, where we don't push ourselves to explore relationships and whatnot. So I really hope that the tough questions, the questions that make people feel uncomfortable and maybe a little defensive and whatnot, are actually the kinds of questions we keep asking, that you ask of us, that we ask of you, that we ask of anybody we work with, that the community asks of us. And I think, one of the things you said, Ms. Willis, is that like you're operating from the standpoint that we do need them and we should still be asking you questions, which I think is a really great, sort of starting point to say like, okay, so if we're moving forward with this, let's just also all get on the same page across the board, et cetera, with why we're doing this, and make sure we're all on the same page. So I'll just echo, thank you for being here, for all the questions and whatnot. And do we have a timeline on by when we'd like to have this turned around so that there is that clarity? Because y'all are in the schools, you're doing the work. I think the sooner we get it done, the better. I know it's on our end to get something back.
I may also make a comment to Ms. Willis. I hope you understand my energy is not meant in a negative way. I don't want you to misinterpret that, because I share the same zeal and enthusiasm that I think all the collective does here. And we want to get this right. We absolutely want to get this right. So please don't misinterpret it. I wasn't trying to sound attacking at all.
No.
I want to get this done because we all have budget cycle. We also have operational needs. I mean, that's why Dr. Means and I are continually talking. My Sergeant Morrell's continually talking to Laura about where are we taking this. Let's get it rolling because the school year is already in full swing.
And if I could just say too, in response to that, in my role, I feel like I need to advocate for all students, and that's what I'm doing. I'm offering you a perspective and things to consider that advocate for the safety of all of our students. It's not a personal attack on the police department. It's not a personal attack on the SROs or the program that's within our schools, but my educator had again, is this the best practice? Like, are we following the best practices that are going to ensure the safety, both physical and psychological safety of all of our students when we adopt programs like this? And unfortunately, our district and the police department hasn't analyzed this and the term of its relationship. And that's, it's unfortunate, but I feel like we need to reconcile some of the things that have happened in the past and make sure that we are doing things right for all of our students.
To your point as well, you just have a new social worker, correct, that works in the school district. That changes that dynamic as well. And people have said, police officers you wear too many hats. Well, we're not there to be social workers. We do part of social work as part of policing, but it's not our role. So it's finding that middle ground, I think, especially as dynamics change. So.
And I just want to make one comment as far as defensiveness. You are correct. I was getting defensive. I apologize to you for being defensive with you. I am defensive. I'm passionate about the program. We're all in this for the same thing. We have the best interest of the students, staff, families in mind. I know that we've done this for nearly 20 years, and I know that we've never had any of these types of conversations until myself and actually Sonia Phillips, the school social worker at Tosa East, said, we have got to get an MOU. And the NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers, says you should not operate without an MOU. And I started looking at this years ago as an SRO, like, we need this. And so we do all this work and we try to work with each other in partnership. And now I feel like at times we are defending ourselves, like trying to defend our position and what it is we do. And I apologize if I come off as defensive. It's merely because I'm passionate about it. And I feel like we're doing the right things. So thank you guys for your patience with that.
May I say something complimentary?
We're going to go to Ms. Meefo first because she's been super patient, and then we'll come to you.
Sorry.
No, I give Ms. Willis the patience credit. So are you completed in your questions before okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Meefo, for us.
So one thing that occurred to me in this discussion that we were having of responsibilities, can we reference these different laws, policies right in the body of the MOU? So it's very clear referencing for what the school district expects, what the law requires. I don't know how quite to do that. But in many contracts and agreements, there are links in that manner, which clarifies the responsibilities, because as serving in the safety, capacity as a board member, the situations change. I mean, we're always trying to react and respond to security questions and these situations on an ongoing basis. And what we did 10 years ago isn't going to work right now. So that would be my first point. I know we've talked a lot about student examples and how SROs handle student examples, but the SROs also play a role in listening to students for see it, say it, and listening, and they bring to the SROs situations, unfortunately, even related to administration that have been investigated and needed, for criminal behavior. I'll just be honest about that. And that happened with one of our high schools and our administration at the high school. So thankfully, once that trust is established, once you're embedded in the schools and you have those relationships, some students won't be comfortable, but the more you can help, and I know that there's been many situations where the SROs have helped students, have been in difficult adult situations. So I just wanted to say that. And then one thing that is on the top of my mind, because we just approved the resolution for Dale Brightlow. We've had weapon incidents, live weapons in our schools. As a board member, I voted for this program initially because I wanted to do everything in my power preventative to deter any kind of safety incidents. And I wonder, as part of your role with us and looking at our facilities again, I know that's something that the department wants to help us with. And, can we consider, and this might be, I don't know what you're going to think of this, but it's something across the country that people are doing, not only in schools, and we've had to change the way we've been doing things structurally in schools. We didn't have passcodes, we didn't have things like that. But people have approached me, kids, community members, do we need metal detectors to deter weapons in our schools? And when I voted for this program, the community at that time were not receptive at all about the SRO program. but I feel that there's a juncture right now where we have fights escalating for many reasons. We understand and don't understand. The threat of fights is dangerous enough, but include a weapon and it's catastrophic. And I want to do everything in my power as a board member to protect our facilities. And I'm bringing this point up because I know the police department will help us audit again for our the safety of our facilities. And I just want to put that on the table.
Of course, we'll assist on it. I mean, I know magnetometers are very expensive, magnetic wands, but it's also palatability. Is there a necessity? That would be something that would need to be researched, but sometimes you have to make the decision if that's where you want to go as a school board. You just do it. You don't want to be responding to another. I went to high school, as you all know, with the gentleman who killed Mr. Brightlow right here in Wauwatosa. So this one rings home to me. We'll help in providing counsel, guidance, those kinds of things. I don't know what the answer is. Again, it depends on which way you want to take it as a board.
Yeah, I mean, concealed carry laws don't help us either. And I just, I feel strongly to do everything possible. And I want to ask the police department to staff one more police officer for us so that we have all 4 secondary schools staffed with SROs. Please help us.
It's a conversation that Dr. Means and I have been having, as well as Ms. Geisler. Is it Geisler? Geisler.
No R.
And Sergeant Morrow, we've been talking about process and then the systems when it comes to events at Hart Park or fights happening in the schools. What can we do to help provide that guidance to increase security or safety capacity within the school? I thought you were going to ask, how do you feel about hiring security guards to work within the schools? Hey, if that's your choice, I still think you need to have somebody who has that investigative or arrest authority around. It's no different than having event staff at a football game. You use visible deterrence. You put, and there's a reason why we wear those big vests out there, those yellow vests, so people can see us. It's a visual deterrent, but it's not going to solve all the ills of the world either.
Right.
So,
but it will help.
Those type of process changes will help increase security capacity in the school. That's why we have this dialogue and this ongoing conversation about how can we mitigate those things happening.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take this to a way high political theory level, and I'm sure you'll understand, and our APSE students, I'm sure will understand. This meeting has been so special. And because this isn't like a customer vendor thing. The school district sits as holder of a piece of the sovereign and with a mandate to stand in local parentis, not the parent with the hat, but in local parentis over thousands of children. We are a piece of the sovereign. The police department holds a piece of the sovereign that they have mandate for legitimate use of force. And these two holders of separate pieces of the sovereign, have sat together tonight for hours and tried to solve problems and make our community better. Of course, there's going to be some anxiety because neither are customers, neither are vendors, but we are 2 different government entities with our own independent mandate and mission and rule sets that are working together for the community. So as we go to this examination with our school district piece of the sovereign, how should we operate when we invite the police piece of the sovereign and share a space with us? And that's hard because we don't do that with anybody else. And I don't think you do that well. You have other police entities perhaps, but we don't work with other pieces of the sovereign. We answer to DPI, and that's pretty much, that's a subservient relationship. but we have to work together as kind of titans in a community for the good of Wauwatosa. And we haven't done, I don't remember, Ms. Neufeld, have we done a meeting like this in 18 years? We broke new ground tonight. And yeah, there's going to be tough questions and needs and things, but, and so I'm just ecstatic over what we've done tonight as two pieces of government in Wauwatosa.
We had some final comments from this side of the room. Anything from? I'm deeply impressed with everybody's questions, your thoughtfulness, pushing me to think about this in a variety of different ways. Thank you for kind of the give and take and the dynamic tension we have around this. Dr. Means, the question was asked, I'm not sure if I don't have clarity. Do we have a sense of timeline of realistically and maybe I'm not sure who's kind of doing the markup and the edits, but are we thinking 2 board meetings out?
We'll try to get to this as soon as possible.
So in the coming weeks and months, this will be moving forward. I think the question has been asked, is there a plan to drop the SRO program is under consideration? We're basically starting from something that a lot of people have identified as there being a need in lots of different ways for this MOU. Something that I think we all would agree that we would have been benefit to have many years ago. So we're doing that hard work now. We'll learn from it. I'm excited about the data pieces, as well as your kind of root cause analysis component is, I think, something that we'll bring back to the board and talk about. Dr. Means brought up once again, as he does every board meeting, the importance of examining policy and aligning. Thank you. Come on. And so the board is going to have some more homework on this as well. Thank you to everybody who was here tonight. Any final thoughts or questions from my colleagues? Any closing comments from Chief or Dr. Means? For me.
Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to the continued work.
Great. It is 8:57 p.m. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Dr. Means, can you call the roll?
Ms. Bienfeld,
Yes.
Ms. Fraley,
Yes.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes.
Dr. Jessup Anger,
Yes.
Dr. Hoig,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Ms. Willis.
Yes.
Okay.